Psychic Self-Defense. By Dion Fforchun. Preface. It is with a sense of the seriousness of the issues involved that I set myself to the task of writing a book on psychic attack and the best methods of defense against it. The undertaking is beset with pitfalls. It is hardly possible to give practical information on the methods of psychic defense without at the same time giving practical information on the methods of psychic attack. It is not without reason that initiates have always guarded their secret science behind closed doors. To disclose sufficient to be adequate without disclosing sufficient to be dangerous is my problem. But as so much has already been made known concerning the esoteric teachings, and as the circle of students of the occult is becoming rapidly wider every day, it may well be that the time has now come for plain speaking. The task is not of my seeking, but as it has come into my hands, I will do my best to discharge it honorably. Making available the knowledge which has come to me in the course of many years' experience of the strange byways of the mind which the mystic shares with the lunatic. This knowledge has not been attained without cost, nor, I suspect, will the divulging of it be altogether free from cost either. I have endeavored to avoid, as far as possible, the use of second-hand material. We all know the person who has a friend whose friend saw the ghost with her own eyes. That is not of very much use to anybody. What we need is to have the eyewitness under cross-examination. For this reason I have not drawn upon the vast literature of the subject for illustrations of my thesis, but have preferred to rely upon cases that have come within the range of my own experience and which I have been able to examine. I think I may fairly claim to have practical, and not merely theoretical, qualifications for the task. My attention was first turned to psychology, and subsequently to occultism as the real key to psychology, by the personal experience of a psychic attack which left me with shattered health for a considerable period. I know for myself the peculiar horror of such an experience, its insidiousness, its potency, and its disastrous effects on mind and body. It is not easy to get people to come forward and bear witness to psychic attacks. Firstly, because they know there is very little likelihood of their being believed, and that they will be more likely to earn themselves a reputation for mental unbalance than for anything else. Secondly, because any tampering with the foundations of the personality is an experience of such peculiar and unique horror that the mind shrinks from the contemplation of it and one cannot talk about. I am of the opinion that psychic attacks are far commoner than is generally realized, even by occultists themselves. Certainly the general public has no conception at all of the sort of things that are done by people who have a knowledge of the powers of the human mind and set to work to exploit them. I am convinced that this factor played a large part in the witch cult, and was the real cause of the universal horror and detestation of the witch. These powers have always been known to students of occultism, but nowadays they are known and used by people who would be exceedingly surprised to find who are their fellow practitioners. Mrs. Eddy, the founder of Christian Science, stumbled on to these methods empirically without ever acquiring any rational knowledge as to their modus operandi. She endeavored to teach them in such a way that they could only be used for good and their power for evil should be concealed. But that she herself was well aware of their possibilities if abused is witnessed by the dread of what she called malicious animal magnetism, which shadowed her whole life. The methods of Christian Science, without its strict discipline and careful organization, were developed and exploited by the innumerable schools and sects of the New Thought movement. In many of the developments the religious aspect was lost sight of, and they simply became a method of mental manipulation for purely personal ends, though not necessarily deliberately evil. Their exponents advertised that they would teach the art of salesmanship, of making oneself popular and dominant in society, of attracting the opposite sex, of drawing to oneself money and success. The amazing number of these courses advertised shows their popularity. In a recent issue of an American magazine I counted advertisements for 63 different courses in various forms of mind power. They would not be so popular if they achieved no results at all. Let us consider some of these advertisements and see what they indicate, reading between the lines and drawing our own conclusions. Transfer your thoughts to others. Send for free folder, telepathy, or mental radio. Troubled, health, love, money. Let me help you. No failures, instructions being followed. Strictly personal and professional. Careful as family physician. $5 must accompany inquiry. Money back if not satisfied. What do you want? Whatever it is, we can help you to get it. Just give us the chance by writing for Clouds Dispelled. Absolutely free. You will be delighted. Hypnotism. Would you possess that strange mysterious power which charms and fascinates men and women, influences their thoughts, controls their desires and makes you supreme master of every situation? Life is full of alluring possibilities for those who master the secrets of hypnotic influence, for those who develop their magnetic powers. You can learn at home, cure diseases and bad habits without drugs, win the friendship and love of others, increase your income, gratify your ambitions, drive worry and trouble from your mind, improve your memory, overcome domestic difficulties. Give the most thrilling entertainment ever witnessed and develop a wonderfully magnetic will power that will enable you to overcome all obstacles to your success. You can hypnotize people instantly, quick as a flash, put yourself or anyone else to sleep at any hour of the day or night, or banish pain and suffering. Our free book tells you the secrets of this wonderful science. It explains exactly how you can use this power to better your condition in life. It is enthusiastically endorsed by ministers of the gospel, lawyers, doctors, businessmen and society women. It benefits everybody. It costs nothing. We give it away to advertise our institution. These are a few specimens chosen from among the 63 similar advertisements counted in this single issue of a popular weekly magazine. They are given in extenso, in no way edited save by the omission of addresses. Let us now consider what such advertisements as these signify from the point of view of the persons to whom they are not addressed, the persons over whom the reader is presumed to want to acquire power. What will be their position should he break the 10th commandment and covet his neighbor's wife, or his ox, or his ass, or any of his other valuables? Supposing the diligent student of these methods wants something he ought not to have. Supposing he is on the shady side of the law. Or is nursing a sense of injury and desires to be revenged. Or merely loves power for its own sake. What is the fate of the cannon fodder that supplies the student of mind power with the material for his experiments? What does it feel like to be dominated by these methods, and what results may ultimately be obtained by a competent experimenter? Let me give my own experience, painful though it is, for someone has got to be the first to come forward and uncover these abuses which are only able to flourish because of the general failure to realize their significance. As a young girl of 20 I entered the employment of a woman who I now know must have had a considerable knowledge of occultism obtained during a long residence in India, and concerning which she used to drop hints that I could make nothing of at the time, but which, in the light of later knowledge, I have come to understand. It was her custom to control her staff by means of her knowledge of mind power, and she had a steady succession of most peculiar breakdowns among the people working under her. I had not been with her very long when she wanted me to give evidence in a lawsuit. She was a woman of violent temper, and had dismissed an employee without notice and without wages, and he was suing her for the money due to him. She wanted me to say that his behavior had been such that she was justified in thus dismissing him. Her method of collecting my evidence was to look into my eyes with a concentrated gaze and say, such and such things happened. Fortunately for all concerned I had kept a diary and had a day-to-day record of the whole transaction. If it had not been for this I should not have known where I was. At the end of the interview I was dazed and exhausted, and lay down on my bed in my clothes and slept the sleep of utter exhaustion till next morning. I suppose I slept for about 15 hours. Soon after this she wanted my testimony again. She wished to get rid of my immediate superior, and wanted to find sufficient grounds to justify her in doing so. She repeated her previous maneuvers, but this time I had not got a diary record to fall back upon. And to my intense surprise I found myself agreeing with her in a series of entirely baseless charges against the character of a man I had no reason to believe to be otherwise than perfectly straight. The same exhaustion and the same dead sleep descended upon me immediately after this interview as after the preceding one, but an additional symptom now manifested itself. As I walked out of the room at the end of the interview, I had a curious sensation as if my feet were not in the place I expected them to be. Anyone who has walked across a carpet that is bellying up with the underfloor draft will know what I mean. Occultists will recognize it as having to do with the extrusion of the etheric double. The next incident to occur in this curious menage did not concern myself, but another girl, an orphan with considerable means. My employer kept this girl constantly with her, and finally persuaded her to put the whole of her capital into her schemes. However, trustees descended in wrath, forced my employer to disgorge, and took the girl away with them then and there, leaving all her belongings behind, to be packed up and sent on to her afterwards. Another incident followed quick on the heels of this one. There was an elderly woman in the establishment who was slightly mentally. A dear old thing, but childlike and eccentric. My employer now turned her attention to her, and we watched the same process of domination beginning. In this case there were no trustees to interfere, and the poor old lady was being persuaded to take her affairs out of the hands of her brother, who had hitherto managed them, and commit them to the tender mercies of my employer. My suspicions had by now been thoroughly aroused. It was more than I could bear to see old Auntie rooked, so I took a hand in the game, woke Auntie up to the situation, pushed her belongings into a box, and got her off to her relatives while my employer was away for a brief absence. I hoped my complicity in the affair would not become known, but I was soon disillusioned. My employer's secretary came to my room one night, after lights out, and warned me that the warden, as we called our employer, had found out who it was that had engineered Auntie's escape, and I had better look out for trouble. Knowing her to be of an exceedingly revengeful nature, I knew that my best refuge was flight, but flight was not altogether easy to achieve. The institution in which I was employed was an educational one, and a term's notice had to be given before leaving. I did not look forward to working out that term under the unchecked control of a spiteful woman. So I watched for an opportunity that should justify me in walking out. With my employer's uncontrolled temper it was not long to seek. I was up late the following night packing, in preparation for my intended flight, when there came to my room another member of the staff, a girl who seldom spoke, had no friends, and went about her work like an automaton. I had never had any dealings with her, and was more than surprised at her visit. It was soon explained, however. "You are going to leave," she said. I admitted that it was so. "Then go without seeing the warden. You will not get away if you don't. I have tried several times, and I cannot get away." However, I was young and confident in my untried strength, with no means of gauging the forces arrayed against me, and next morning, dressed for the journey and suitcase in hand, I went down and bearded my formidable employer in her den. Determined to tell her what I thought of her and her methods, quite unsuspicious that anything save ordinary knavery and bullying was afoot. I was not allowed to get started with my carefully prepared speech, however. As soon as she learnt that I was leaving, she said, "Very well, if you want to go, go you shall. But before you go you have got to admit that you are incompetent and have no self-confidence." To which I replied, being still full of fight, that if I were incompetent, why did she not dismiss me herself, and anyway, I was the product of her own training, school. Which remark naturally did not improve matters. Then commenced a most extraordinary litany. She resumed her old trick of fixing me with an intent gaze, and said, "You are incompetent, and you know it. You have no self-confidence, and you have got to admit it." To which I replied, "That is not true. I know my work, and you know I know it." Now there was no doubt that much could be said concerning my competency in my first post at the age of 20, with a great deal of responsibility on my shoulders, and newly inducted into a disorganized department. But nothing whatever could be said against my self-confidence, except that I had too much of it. I was quite prepared to rush in where archangels would have hung back in the collar. My employer did not argue or abuse me. She kept on with these two statements repeated like the responses of a litany. I entered her room at 10 o'clock, and I left it at 2. She must have said these two phrases several hundreds of times. I entered it a strong and healthy girl. I left it a mental and physical wreck and was ill for 3 years. Some instinct warned me that if I admitted I were incompetent and had no self-confidence, my nerve would be broken, and I would never be good for anything afterwards. And I recognized that this peculiar maneuver on the part of my employer was an act of revenge. Why I did not pursue the obvious remedy of taking refuge in flight, I do not know, but by the time one realizes that something abnormal is toward on these occasions, one is more or less glamored. And just as the bird before the snake cannot use its wings, so one cannot move or turn away. Gradually everything began to feel unreal. All I knew was that I had to hold on at all costs to the integrity of my soul. Once I agreed to her suggestions, I was done for. We went on with our litany. But I was getting near the end of my resources. I had a curious sensation as if my field of vision were narrowing. This, I believe, is a characteristic phenomenon of hysteria. Out of the corners of my eyes I could see 2 walls of darkness creeping up behind me on either side, as if one stood with one's back to the angle of a screen, and it were being slowly closed upon one. I knew that when those 2 walls of darkness met, I should be broken. Then a curious thing happened. I distinctly heard an inner voice say, "Pretend you are beaten before you really are. Then she will let up the attack and you will be able to get away." What this voice was, I have never known. I immediately followed its advice. With my tongue in my cheek I asked my employer's pardon for everything I had ever done or ever should do. I promised to remain on in my post and to go softly all the days of my life. I remember I went down on my knees to her, and she purred complacently over me, well satisfied with the morning's work, as she had every reason to be. Then she let me go, and I went up to my room and lay down on the bed. But I could not rest until I had written her a letter. What that letter contained, I do not know. As soon as I had written it and put it where she would get it, I fell into a sort of stupor, and lay in this state with my mind completely in abeyance till the following evening. That is to say, from 2 o'clock one afternoon till about 8 o'clock of the following day, 30 hours. It was a cold spring day with snow on the ground. A window close to the head of the bed was wide open and the room unheated. I had no covering over me, but I felt neither cold nor hunger, and all the processes of the body were in abeyance. I never stirred. Heartbeat and respiration were very slow, and continued so for several days. I was found eventually by the housekeeper, who revived me by the simple application of a good shaking and a cold sponge. I was dazed, and disinclined to move or even to eat. I was left to lie in bed, my work taking care of itself, the housekeeper coming to look at me from time to time, but making no comment on my condition. My employer never showed herself. After about 3 days my especial friend, who thought I had left the house, learned of my continued presence, and came along to see me, an act requiring some courage, for our mutual employer was a formidable antagonist. She asked me what had happened at my interview with the warden, but I could not tell her. My mind was a blank and all memory of that interview had gone as if a sponge had been passed over a slate. All I knew was that out of the depths of my mind a most terrible state of fear was rising up and obsessing me. Not fear of anything or person. Just plain fear without an object, but none the less terrible for that. I lay in bed with all the physical symptoms of intense fear. Dry mouth, sweating palms, thumping heart and shallow, hasty breathing. My heart was beating so hard that at each beat a loose brass knob on the bedstead rattled. Fortunately for me, my friend saw that something was seriously wrong and she sent for my family, who fetched me away. They were exceedingly suspicious. The warden was exceedingly uncomfortable, but no one could prove anything, so nothing was said. My mind was a blank. I was thoroughly cowed and very exhausted, and my one desire was to get away. I did not recover, however, as had been expected. The intensity of the symptoms wore off, but I continued to be exceedingly easily tired, as if I had been drained of all vitality. I knew that, somewhere at the back of my mind, was hidden the memory of a terrible experience, and I dared not think of it, because if I did, the shock and strain would be so severe that my mind would give way altogether. My chief consolation was an old-school arithmetic book, and I used to spend hour upon hour doing simple sums to keep my mind from racing itself to pieces and wondering what had been done to me and sidling up towards the memory. And then shying away from it like a frightened horse. Finally I gained some measure of peace by coming to the conclusion that I had simply had a breakdown from overwork, and that the whole queer transaction was the fruit of my imagination. And yet there was a lingering feeling that it was real, and this feeling would not let me rest. About a year after the incident, my health still being very poor, I went away to the country to recuperate, and there came across a friend who had been on the spot at the time of my breakdown. It had apparently caused a good deal of talk, and I found here one who was not inclined to explain away my experience, but asked pertinent questions. Another new friend became interested in my case and hailed me off to the family doctor, who bluntly gave it as his opinion that I had been hypnotized. It was before the days of psychotherapy, and his ministrations to a mind diseased were limited to patting me on the back and giving me a tonic and bromide. The tonic was useful, but the bromide was not, as it lowered my powers of resistance, and I speedily discarded it, preferring to put up with my discomfort rather than to render myself defenseless. For all the time I was obsessed by the fear that this strange force, which had been applied to me so effectually, would be applied again. But although I feared this mysterious power, which I now realized was abroad in the world, I cannot tell what a relief it was to me to find that the whole transaction was not an hallucination, but an actual fact that one could rise up and cope with. I obtained my release from the bondage of this fear by facing the whole situation and determining to find out exactly what had been done to me and how I could protect myself against a repetition of the experience. It was an exceedingly unpleasant process. In fact, the reaction caused by recovering the lost memories was only a little less violent than the original one. But I finally succeeded in freeing myself from my hag-ridden condition of fear, although it was a very long time before my physical health became normal. My body was like an electric battery that has been completely discharged. It took a long time to charge up again, and every time it was used before the charging was completed, it ran down again rapidly. For a long time I had no reserves of energy, and after the least exertion would fall into a dead sleep at any hour of the day. In the language of occultism, the etheric double had been damaged, and leaked prana. It did not become normal until I took initiation into the occult order in which I subsequently trained. Within an hour of the ceremony I felt a change, and it is only upon the rarest occasions since then, after some psychic injury, that I have had a temporary return of those depleting attacks of exhaustion. I have told this story in detail because it is a useful illustration of the manner in which the little-known powers of the mind can be abused by an unscrupulous person. First-hand experience is of far more value than any amount of illustration from the pages of history, however well authenticated. If such a transaction had taken place during the Middle Ages, the parish priest would have organized a witch hunt. In the light of my own experiences, I am not at all surprised that people who had acquired a reputation for the practice of witchcraft were lynched. The methods are so terrible and so intangible. We may think the records of the witch trials are ridiculous, with their tales of wax images melting in front of slow fires, or the crucifying of christened toads, or the reciting of little jingles, such as, horse, haddock, to ride, to ride. But if we understand the use of mind power, we soon realize that these things were simply aids to concentration. There is no essential difference between sticking pins into a wax image of an enemy and burning candles in front of a wax image of the Virgin. You may think that both these practices are gross superstition, but you can hardly think that one is real and potent and deny reality and potency to the other. The weapons of our warfare are not carnal, may as truly be said of the practitioners of black magic as of the Church. My own case belongs more to the realm of psychology than to occultism, the method employed being an application of hypnotic power to improper ends. I have given it, however, because I am convinced that hypnotic methods are very largely used in black magic, and that telepathic suggestion is the key to a large proportion of its phenomena. I cite my own case, painful as it is to me to do so, because an ounce of experience is worth a pound of theory. It was this experience which led me to take up the study of analytical psychology, and subsequently of occultism. As soon as I touched the deeper aspects of practical psychology and watched the dissection of the mind under psychoanalysis, I realized that there was very much more in the mind than was accounted for by the accepted psychological theories. I saw that we stood in the center of a small circle of light thrown by accurate scientific knowledge, but around us was a vast, circumambient sphere of darkness, and in that darkness dim shapes were moving. It was in order to understand the hidden aspects of the mind that I originally took up the study of occultism. I have had my full share of the adventures of the path, have known men and women who could indubitably be ranked as adepts. Seen phenomena such as no séance room has ever known, and borne my share in it. Taken part in psychic feuds, and stood my watch on the roster of the occult police force which, under the masters of the Great White Lodge, keeps guard over the nations, each according to its race. Kept the occult vigil when one dare not sleep while the sun is below the horizon, and hung on desperately, matching my staying power against the attack until the moontides changed and the force of the onslaught blew itself out. And through all these experiences I was learning to interpret occultism in the light of psychology and psychology in the light of occultism, the one counterchecking and explaining the other. Because of my specialized knowledge, people came to me when an occult attack was suspected, and their experience reinforces and supplements my own. Moreover, there is a considerable literature on the subject to be found in quarters where one would least expect it, in accounts of folklore and ethnology, in the state records of witch trials, and even under the guise of fiction. These independent records, by people in no way interested in psychic phenomena, confirm the statements made by those who have experienced occult attacks. On the other hand, we have to distinguish very carefully between psychic experience and subjective hallucination. We have to be sure that the person who complains of a psychic assault is not hearing the reverberation of his own dissociated complexes. The differential diagnosis between hysteria, insanity and psychic attack is an exceedingly delicate and difficult operation, for so frequently a case is not clear-cut, more than one element being present. A severe psychic attack causing a mental breakdown, and a mental breakdown laying its victim open to invasion from the unseen. All these factors have to be borne in mind when investigating an alleged occult attack, and it shall be my task in these pages not only to indicate the methods of occult defense, but also to show the methods of differential diagnosis. It is very necessary, with so much occult knowledge about, that people should know an occult attack when they see it. These things are much more common than is generally realized. The recent tragedy in Iona gives point to this assertion. No occultist is under any illusion as to that death being from natural causes. In my own experience I have known of similar deaths. In my novel, The Secrets of Dr. Taverner, there were presented, under the guise of fiction, a number of cases illustrative of the hypotheses of occult science. Some of these stories were built up to show the operation of the invisible forces, others were drawn from actual cases. And some of these were written down rather than written up in order to render them readable by the general public. So much first-hand experience, confirmed by independent evidence, should not go unregarded, especially since rational explanations are difficult to find save in terms of the occult hypotheses. It may be possible to explain away each individual case mentioned in these pages by alleging hallucination, fraud, hysteria, or plain lying, but it is not possible to explain the sum total of them in this way. There cannot be so much smoke without some fire. It is not possible that the prestige of the magician in antiquity and the dread of the witch in the Middle Ages could have arisen without some basis in experience. The vaporings of the wise woman would be no more heeded than those of the village idiot if no painful consequences had ever been found to follow upon them. Fear was the motive of these persecutions, and fear founded upon bitter experience. For it was not officialdom which incited the witch burnings, but whole countrysides that rose up for a lynching. The universal horror of the witch must have some cause behind it. The labyrinthine windings of the left-hand path are as extensive as they are devious. But while exposing them in something, at any rate, of their horror, I still maintain that the right-hand path of initiation in occult knowledge is a way to the loftiest mystical experiences and a means of lifting the burden of human suffering. Not every student of this knowledge necessarily abuses it, there are many, nay, the great majority, who hold it selflessly in trust for mankind, using it to heal and bless and redeem that which is lost. It may well be asked, if this knowledge can be so disastrously abused, why should its veil ever be lifted? What answer is made to this question is a matter of temperament. Some will maintain that knowledge of whatever kind cannot be without its value. Others may say we had better let sleeping dogs lie. The trouble is, however, that sleeping dogs have an unfortunate knack of waking up spontaneously. So much occult knowledge is abroad in the world, so much of the kind of things described in these pages is going on unknown and unsuspected in our midst, that it is very desirable that men of goodwill should investigate the forces which men of evil will have perverted to their own ends. These things are the pathologies of the mystic life, and if they were better understood, many tragedies might be averted. On the other hand, it is not well that everybody should indulge in the study of textbooks of pathology. A vivid imagination and a weak head are a disastrous combination. The readers of that one-time bestseller, 3 Men in a Boat, may remember the fate of the individual who spent a wet Sunday afternoon reading a medical textbook. At the finish he was firmly convinced he had got every single disease described therein with the single exception of housemaid's knee. This book is not intended merely to make the flesh creep, but is designed as a serious contribution to a little understood aspect of abnormal psychology, perverted, in some instances, to the purposes of crime. It is a book intended for serious students and for those who find themselves confronted by the problems it describes, and who are trying to understand them and find a way out. My chief aim in speaking so frankly is to open the eyes of men and women to the nature of the forces that are at work below the surface of everyday life. It may happen to any one of us to break through the thin crust of normality and find ourselves face to face with these forces. Reading of the cases cited in this book, we may well say that there, but for the grace of God, goes any one of us. If I can give in these pages the knowledge which protects, I shall have fulfilled my purpose. How do you find this book? Any thoughts about the book or the author? Any suggestion for improvement? Please take a moment to share your thoughts in a comment. If you like it, share it with your friends who might enjoy it as well. Subscribe to keep in touch. Visit CompleteAudiobooks.com for more quality content. Part 1. Types of Psychic Attack. Chapter 1. Signs of Psychic Attack. If we look at the universe around us, we cannot fail to realize that there must be some overruling plan coordinating its infinite complexity. If we take into our hands and examine minutely any living thing, however simple, equally must we realize that the ordered diversity of its parts is built up on a determining framework. Science has sought in vain for this organizing principle. It will never find it on the physical plane, for it is not physical. It is not the inherent nature of atoms which causes them to arrange themselves in the complex patterns of living tissues. The driving forces of the universe, the framework upon which it is built up in all its parts, belong to another phase of manifestation than our physical plane, having other dimensions than the 3 to which we are habituated, and perceived by other modes of consciousness than those to which we are accustomed. We live in the midst of invisible forces whose effects alone we perceive. We move among invisible forms whose actions we very often do not perceive at all, though we may be profoundly affected by them. In this mind side of nature, invisible to our senses, intangible to our instruments of precision, many things can happen that are not without their echo on the physical plane. There are beings that live in this invisible world as fish live in the sea. There are men and women with trained minds, or special aptitudes, who can enter into this invisible world as a diver descends to the ocean bed. There are also times when, as happens to a land when the sea dikes break, the invisible forces flow in upon us and swamp our lives. Normally this does not occur. We are protected by our very incapacity to perceive these invisible forces. There are 4 conditions, however, in which the veil may be rent and we may meet the unseen. We may find ourselves in a place where these forces are concentrated. We may meet people who are handling these forces. We may ourselves go out to meet the unseen, led by our interest in it, and get out of our depth before we know where we are, or we may fall victim to certain pathological conditions which rend the veil. The threshold of the unseen is a treacherous coast on which to bathe. There are potholes and currents and quicksands. The strong swimmer, who knows plus or minus he coast, may venture in comparative safety. The non-swimmer, who takes counsel of nothing but his own impulses, may pay for his temerity with his life. But we must not make the mistake of thinking that these invisible forces are necessarily evil and inimical to humanity. They are no more inimical in themselves than are water or fire, but they are potent. If we run counter to them, the result is disastrous for us, for we have broken a natural law. But they are not out to attack us, any more than we are out to attack them. We must face the fact, however, that men and women with knowledge of these things, have, both in the past and in the present, used that knowledge unscrupulously, and that we may find ourselves involved in the results of their actions. It may safely be said that the unseen is only evil and inimical to humanity when it has been corrupted and perverted by the activities of these unscrupulous men and women, whom initiates call adepts of the left-hand path. We must consider the outward and visible signs of psychic attack before we are in a position to analyze the nature of such attacks and indicate their source of origin. It is a fundamental rule that diagnosis must precede treatment. There are many different kinds of psychic attacks, and the methods that will dispose of one will be ineffectual against another. The commonest form of psychic attack is that which proceeds from the ignorant or malignant mind of our fellow human beings. We say ignorant as well as malignant, for all attacks are not deliberately motived. The injury may be as accidental as that inflicted by a skidding car. This must always be borne in mind, and we should not impute malice or wickedness as a matter of course when we feel we are being victimized. Our persecutor may himself be a victim. We should not accuse a man of malice if we had linked hands with him and he had stepped on a live rail. Nevertheless, we should receive at his hands a severe shock. So it may be with many an occult attack. The person from whom it emanates may not have originated it. Therefore we should never respond to attack by attack, thus bringing ourselves down to the moral level of our attackers, but rely upon more humane methods, which are, in reality, equally effectual and far less dangerous to handle. People also come into touch with the unseen through the influence of places. Someone who is not actually psychic, but who is sufficiently sensitive to perceive the invisible forces subconsciously, may go to a place where they are concentrated at a high tension. Normally, although we move in the midst of these forces, for they sustain our universe, we are oblivious of them. Where they are concentrated, however, unless we are very dense-minded, we begin to be dimly conscious of something that is affecting us and stirring our subliminal self. It may happen that the barrier between consciousness and subconsciousness is dense in some people, and they are never able clearly to realize what is going on. They merely have the sense of oppression and general malaise, which lifts when they go away to another place. Consequently, the condition may never be detected, and lead to years of ill health and misery. More commonly, however, if there is a definite psychic attack of sufficient force to make itself noticeable at all, there will soon begin to appear characteristic dreams. These may include a sense of weight upon the chest, as if someone were kneeling on the sleeper. If the sense of weight is present, it is certain that the attack emanates locally, for the weight is due to the concentration of etheric substance or ectoplasm, and is sufficiently tangible to press down the scale of a balance when it is possible to capture it for measurement. A great deal of research has been done with materializing mediums upon the nature of this tangible subtle substance, and the reader is referred to the books on the experiments conducted by Crawford with the Galiar Circle at Belfast, and in Paris with Eva C. by other experimenters, for further information and evidence on this subject. It may be noted that Crawford eventually committed suicide for no known reason. A sense of fear and oppression is very characteristic of occult attack, and one of the surest signs that herald it. It is extremely rare for an attack to make itself manifest out of the blue, as it were. We are not in our normal state of mind, body and circumstance, and then find ourselves suddenly in the midst of an invisible battle. An approaching occult influence casts its shadow on consciousness before it makes itself apparent to the non-psychic. The reason for this is that we perceive subconsciously before we realize consciously, and a line of creeping shade indicates the penetrating of the subconscious sensor from below upwards. As the attack progresses, nervous exhaustion becomes increasingly marked, and there may, under certain conditions, which we will consider later, be such wasting of the tissues that the victim is reduced to a mere bloodless shell of skin and bones. Lying on the bed, too weak to move. And yet no definite disease can be demonstrated. Such a case is an extreme example, proceeding unchecked to its logical conclusion. Other issues are possible, however. The resistance may be good, in which case the attack is unable to gain a foothold on the physical plane, and is limited to that borderland between matter and mind which we perceive upon the threshold of sleep. This is a very terrible experience, for the victim is afraid to sleep and cannot keep awake indefinitely. Worn out by fear and lack of sleep, mental breakdown soon supervenes. Nervous exhaustion and mental breakdown are the commoner results of astral attack among white people, for in Europe at any rate it is not often that an attacker is able to bring the attack to a conclusion in the death of the victim. There are, however, records of cases where the victim has died of pure fright. Kipling's terrible story, The End of the Passage, gives an account of such an occurrence. But in addition to the purely subjective phenomena, there will also be objective ones if the attack has any degree of concentration. The phenomenon of repercussion is well known, the phenomenon wherein that which befalls the subtle body is reflected in the dense body, so that after an astral skirmish during sleep, bruises are found on the physical body. Sometimes bruises of a definite pattern. I have seen the print of a goat's hoof and the ace of clubs marked upon the skin as well-defined bruises, passing from blue to yellow and dying away in the course of a few days, as bruises will. Evil odors are another manifestation of an astral attack. The characteristic smell is of decomposing flesh, and it comes and goes capriciously. But while it is manifesting, there is no doubt whatever about it, and anyone who is present can smell it, whether they are psychic or not. I have also known a frightful stench of drains arise when a ritual belonging to the element of earth was being incorrectly performed. Another curious phenomenon is the precipitation of slime. I have not actually seen this myself, but I have first-hand information upon good authority of one such case. The marks are sometimes as if an army of slugs had been marching in ordered formation. Sometimes there is a broad smear of slime, and at others, distinct footprints, often of gigantic size. In the case to which I refer, of which I heard from an eyewitness, the marks were like the footprints of an elephant, enormous tracks on the floor of the drawing-room of a bungalow situated near the sea. Odd footprints appearing from nowhere and leading nowhere, are sometimes observed when there is snow about. I have seen them on 2 occasions on the roof of an outbuilding. They alighted upon the edge of it, as if the walker had stepped off an aeroplane, went straight across, and ended abruptly at the wall of the main building upon which the lean-to abuts. They did not return. A single line of footprints came from nowhere and ended in a lofty wall. A similar happening took place on a very extensive scale in Devon some 50 years ago, and an account of it is to be found in that very curious book, Oddities, by Commander Gould. In this case, however, the prints were not human, but were those of what was apparently the hoof of a donkey. Proceeding in a single line and going straight through walls and over roofs and covering the best part of a couple of 100 miles in a single night on both sides of an unbridged estuary. Those who want confirmatory evidence would do well to consult Commander Gould's book, where the incident is given in detail. There is a curious phenomenon known to occultists as the astral bell. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle makes use of it in one of his Sherlock Holmes stories. This sound varies from a dear, bell-like note to a faint click. I have often heard it resemble the sound made by striking a cracked wineglass with a knife blade. It commonly announces the advent of an entity that is barely able to manifest, and need not necessarily be a herald of evil at all. It may simply be a knock on the door of the physical world to attract the attention of the inhabitants to the presence of one who stands without and would speak with them. If, however, it occurs in the presence of other symptoms of an astral attack, it would give strong evidence in confirmation of the diagnosis. Inexplicable outbreaks of fire are also sometimes seen in this connection. These indicate that elemental forces, not human, are at work. Poltergeist phenomena also occur, in which objects are flung about, bells rung and other noisy manifestations take place. Of course there may be multiplicity of phenomena, more than one type appearing in the same case. Needless to say, the possibility of some natural, material explanation must never be ignored, even in cases where the supernatural element appears most obvious. It should always be diligently sought in every possible direction before any supernormal hypothesis is considered worthy of attention. But on the other hand, we should not be so wedded to materialistic theories that we refuse to take a psychic theory as a working hypothesis if it shows any possibility of being fruitful. After all, the proof of the pudding is in the eating, and if, working on an occult hypothesis, we are able to clear up a case which has resisted all other methods of handling, we have pretty good evidence in support of our contention. We must also bear in mind that the element of deliberate fraud may enter into the most unexpected places. I have seen a drug addict successfully pass himself off for a considerable length of time as the victim of an occult attack. A recent writer in the British Medical Journal declared that whenever he came across a case of bell ringing, knocks, the dripping of water and oil from ceilings, and other untoward happenings, he always looked for the hysterical maidservant. Occultists would be very well advised to do likewise before they begin to worry about the devil. But on the other hand, the wise man, whether occultist or scientist, will not insist upon the hysterical maidservant unless he can catch her red-handed, as he surely will do sooner or later if she is the guilty party. Forged banknotes would never gain currency unless there were such a thing as genuine banknotes. It would never occur to anyone to produce fraudulent psychic phenomena unless there had been some genuine psychic phenomena to act as a pattern for the forgery. The acceptance of an explanation should rest upon the weight of evidence in its favor, not upon one's dislike of its alternatives. I plead that the possibility of a non-material explanation should be investigated in cases where the materialistic hypothesis does not yield results. Not in diseases of the brain and nervous system, nor of the ductless glands, nor in repression of the natural instincts, shall we find the explanation in all cases wherein the mind is afflicted. There is more to man than mind and body. We shall never find the clue to the riddle of life until we realize that man is a spiritual being and that mind and body are the garments of his manifestation. Chapter 2. Analysis of the nature of psychic attack. The essence of a psychic attack is to be found in the principles and operations of telepathic suggestion. If we put together what we know of telepathy and what we know of suggestion, we shall understand its modus operandi. Suggestion is of three kinds: autosuggestion, conscious suggestion and hypnotic suggestion. The distinction, however, is not as fundamental as at first sight appears, for the goal of all suggestions in the subconscious mind is the same, and they do not become operative until it is reached. Suggestion is distinguished from threats and appeals to reason by the fact that these aim at a mark in the conscious mind. If they succeed, they owe their success to the acquiescence of the conscious personality, whether coerced or voluntary. But suggestion does not make its appeal to consciousness, but aims at laying its hands upon the springs of action in the subconsciousness and manipulating them from there. We might compare these two processes to the operation of pulling at the bell knob outside the front door and taking up a floorboard and twitching the bell wires themselves. The result will be the same in both cases: the bell will ring. Threats and argument pull the bell knob with varying degrees of emphasis, from the persistent tinkling of moral suasion to the resounding peal of the blackmailer. Suggestion twitches the wires at various points in their course. Autosuggestion is given by one's own conscious mind to one's own subconscious mind. Now, you may ask, why can I not give orders to my subconscious mind direct, without having to resort to the paraphernalia of suggestion? The answer to this question is very simple. The subconscious mind belongs to a much earlier phase of evolution than the conscious mind, belongs, in fact, to a phase prior to the development of speech. To address it in words, therefore, is like speaking to a man in a language he does not understand. In order to deal with him we must have resort to sign language. So it is with the subconscious mind. It is no use to say to it, do this, or, don't do that. We must make a mental picture of the thing we want done and hold it in consciousness till it begins to sink into the subconsciousness. The subconscious mind will understand this picture, and act upon it. The actor who wishes to cure himself of stage fright will fail to do so if he says to his subconscious mind, don't be frightened, for a nod is as good as a wink to a blind horse. Equally, if he makes a mental picture of stage fright and says to his subliminal self, now don't do that, the result will be disastrous, for the subliminal self will see the picture and omit the negative. Because the word not means nothing to it. In order to handle the subconscious mind effectually, we make a mental picture of the thing we want done and hold it in mind by repeated applications until the subconsciousness begins to be influenced and takes up the task of its own accord. This is the end result of all suggestion, and the different kinds of suggestion are distinguished, not by the difference in end result, but by the gate through which they enter the subconscious mind. Autosuggestion originates in our own consciousness, waking suggestion originates in the mind of another and is conveyed to our mind by the ordinary channels of the spoken or written word. Hypnotic suggestion enters the subconscious mind direct, without impinging upon consciousness at all. Hypnotic suggestion, which means, literally, suggestion made during sleep, and is to some extent a misnomer, is of three kinds. Firstly, true hypnotic suggestion. Made when the subject has been rendered insensible by magnetic passes or fixation of the eyes on a bright object. Secondly, suggestion given during normal sleep, as Ku advises should be done with children, in my opinion a most undesirable proceeding, and, thirdly, telepathic suggestion. All these modes of suggestion enter the mind behind the censor. That is to say, they are independent of consciousness, which is neither asked to cooperate, nor has the power to inhibit them. In most cases, suggestions made in this way are never recognized as coming from outside, but are only discovered after they have matured in the subconsciousness and are beginning to take effect. We do not see the invisible seed, that has been sown in our mind by the mind of another, but in due course germination takes place and the strong growing shoot appears above the threshold of consciousness as if it were a native growth. The skillful suggestionist always aims at making his suggestions harmonize with the bias of the personality, for if they do not, the established subconscious complexes will expel them before they have time to strike root. All he can really do is to reinforce and stimulate the ideas and impulses that are already there, though perhaps latent. He cannot plant an entirely alien seed. He cannot graft a rose shoot on a lilac bush, for it will merely wither and die. For growth of the thought seeds of suggestion to take place they must find a congenial soil. It is herein lies the strength of the defense. We may not be able to prevent the minds of others from sending us suggestions, but we may so purify the soil of our own natures that no harmful ones can find a congenial seedbed. It is a simple matter to pull up a seedling nettle, but it is quite a different business to eradicate a thick-set bank of tangled roots and stinging shoots, many years old. It has been said, and not untruly, that a person cannot be hypnotized into doing anything which is contrary to his real nature. But what is the real nature of each one of us? Have we all overcome the ape and tiger, or are they merely caged? Suggestion can unbar the cage of all our secret temptations and let them loose upon us. None but the saint is naturally immune. It is possible to reduce anybody to anything provided suggestion has unchecked scope for a sufficient length of time. The purest woman can be made a harlot, the noblest man a murderer under certain conditions. Knowledge is necessary to protect, and it is that knowledge which I intend to give in these pages. Let us now consider exactly how a psychic attack operates. In the realms of mind there is neither time nor space as we understand them. I do not propose to argue this statement philosophically, but state it as a fact of experience which anyone who is accustomed to operating on the inner planes will have shared. If we think of a person, we are in touch with that person. If we picture them clearly, it is as if we were face to face with them. If we picture them vaguely, it is as if we saw them in the distance. Being in the mental vicinity of a person, we can create a thought atmosphere by dwelling upon certain ideas in connection with him. This is how spiritual healing is done. The affirmations of Christian Science are used in order to get the mind of the healer into a certain emotional state, and his condition effectually influences the mind of the patient with whom he has put himself en rapport. This power, however, can be used for evil as well as good. The founder of Christian Science was wise enough to put her teaching in such a way that her students would not readily discern the second edge of the sword. As long as the world in general was ignorant of the powers of the mind, it was better that nothing should be said by those who knew, because the knowledge, if spread abroad indiscriminately, might do more harm than good. Giving information to those who ought not to have it. But now that so much is generally known and even practiced concerning the powers of the human mind, it is as well that the real facts should also be known and the whole matter brought out into the open. And as far as lies in my power, I am prepared to do this. Any message to the subconscious mind must be couched in very simple terms, because subconscious thought is a primitive form of mentation, developed before spoken language was known to mankind. The primary aim of the suggestion is to create a mental atmosphere about the soul of the person, whether that person is to be attacked or healed, until a sympathetic response or reaction is elicited within the soul itself. I use the term soul to include both the mental and emotional processes, but to exclude the spiritual ones. Once this reaction is achieved, the battle is half over, for the gate of the city has been opened from within, and there is free ingress. The telepathic suggestion of definite ideas can now proceed rapidly. It is this point which is the critical one in any occult attack. Up to this point, the defender has the advantage. If he has sufficient knowledge, the knowledge I hope to make available through this book, he can without any undue exertion retain that advantage indefinitely, and wear his attackers down. Even if unable to meet them on their own ground of occult knowledge. There is nothing in this world or the next that a hypnotist can do with the person who keeps his nerve and won't pay attention. There are two gates, and two only, by which the attacker can gain entrance to the city of man-soul, and these are the self-preservation instinct and the sex instinct. The hypnotic appeal must be couched in terms of one or both of these if it is to be successful. How does the attacker proceed? He has to create an atmosphere about the soul of his victim on the inner planes. He can only do this by creating that atmosphere within his own consciousness while he thinks of his victim. If he wants to perform a psychic murder, he must fill his own soul with the rage of destruction until it overflows. If he wants to perform a psychic rape, he must fill his soul with lust and cruelty. The cold rage of cruelty is essential to effectual operations of this nature. Now what happens when he does this? He has sounded a ringing keynote in the abyss. It will be answered. All beings who have this keynote for the basis of their nature will respond. Dark Uriel and Azrael and Ammon on the wing, and will join in the operation. But they do not operate direct upon the victim, they work through the operator. It is like the old game of nuts and may, in which the one who is sent to fetch her away is gripped round the waist by the leader of a chain of supporters. The real pressure comes on his own abdominal muscles, as anyone who has played the game will remember. And when the magical operation is over, what then? Will the operator be left to enjoy his victim in peace? Is it likely? This is the mystical basis of the story of Faust. The devil might be not only willing but anxious to enable Dr. Faustus to win Margarita, but he came for his soul at the appointed time. We may also remember that if Margarita had not responded to the lure of the jewel song, she would not have fallen a victim. The weak spot in the defense was after all in her own nature. We have considered the modus operandi of telepathic suggestion in detail because it forms the real basis of every kind of occult attack. Whether it be a discarnate entity, a being of another order of evolution, a demon from the pit, or merely the panic-stricken soul of a selfish friend, clinging to the life of form regardless of consequences. In all cases the opening gambit is the same. Until the aura is pierced, there can be no entrance to the soul, and the aura is always pierced from within by the response of fear or desire going out towards the attacking entity. If we can inhibit that instinctive emotional reaction, the edge of the aura will remain impenetrable, and will be as sure a defense against psychic invasion as the healthy and unbroken skin is a defense against bacterial infection. It happens sometimes, however, that a rapport has been formed with the attacking entity in a previous incarnation, and therefore it holds, as it were, the key to the postern. Such a problem is a very difficult one, and external assistance is needed for its solution. The difficulty is increased by the fact that the victim is often disinclined to allow the break to be made, being bound to the attacking entity, whether discarnate or incarnate, by bonds of fascination, or even genuine affection. A case with which I was acquainted throws so much light on various aspects of psychic interference by incarnate souls operating out of their bodies that it is of value to quote it at length. In the summer of 1926 I saw in the papers a short paragraph describing the death of a certain man and his wife, which took place within a few hours of each other. A couple of years previously I had been consulted by a friend of the wife, who was deeply perturbed about the state of affairs, and suspected psychic interference. The wife, Mrs. C. we will call her, had begun to be troubled by nightmares, waking up in a state of intense fear, hearing the echoes of menacing words ringing in her ears. At about the same time the husband, Mr. C. developed what at first sight looked like epileptic fits. A careful diagnosis by specialists, however, determined that although epileptiform, they were not true epilepsy. Epilepsy is due either to a congenital tendency, whose nature is not fully understood by medical science, or to some injury or disease of the brain. In congenital epilepsy the disease shows itself early in life. In fits due to disease, other symptoms are present which can be detected by a physical examination, such as changes in the eye that are revealed by the ophthalmoscope. The diagnosis can therefore be definitely established. Moreover, there is one sure sign by means of which an epileptic fit can be distinguished with certainty from a hysterical or psychic seizure. In true epilepsy the urine is involuntarily voided in the course of the fit. This is a sure sign, and when it is absent we are safe in saying that the fit is not epileptic, whatever else it may be. This is a useful point for those who have to deal with the pathologies that afflict the psychic temperament, for they will see plenty of seizures, and a sure method of distinguishing those that are of organic origin is very useful. We must not, however, conclude that all cases of such incontinence are epileptics, for there are many other causes, both organic and functional. In the case of Mr. C, this cardinal symptom was lacking. The attacks, moreover, always took place in sleep, and it seemed as if they were more of the form of severe nightmare, verging on somnambulism. It was a curious factor in the case that Mrs. C.'s nightmares usually heralded Mr. C.'s attacks. These occurrences showed a certain cyclic regularity, occurring about once a month. In the case of a woman this would naturally be referred to the 28-day cycle of her nature, but in the case of a man, no such explanation was forthcoming. And we therefore had to look for another 28-day cycle to explain his periodicity. The only other cycle of this period is that of the phases of the moon. We were then confronted by a correlation of epileptiform attacks, which had no organic basis, the nightmares of a second person, and the phases of the moon. Some theory had to be found which would resume these three and explain their interrelationship. A dream is commonly the first way in which psychic manifestations make themselves known, the subconscious perceptions being reflected into consciousness in this form. It is held by many occultists that congenital epilepsy, as distinguished from that due to tumors of the brain, has its roots in the operations of black magic or witchcraft in which the sufferer participated in a past life. Whether as practitioner or victim, the fit being an astral struggle with a discarnate entity, reflected on the physical body by means of the well-known phenomenon of repercussion. The moon plays a very important part in all occult operations, different tides being available at different phases of her cycle. Persephone, Diana and Hecate, all aspects of Luna, are three very different persons. It therefore appeared probable that as the physical investigation had drawn blank, a psychic investigation might yield fruits. One was performed. And with the following results. Nothing at all was discerned with regard to Mrs. C. She was merely what lawyers call an accessory after the fact. But the psychic trail of Mr. C. was soon picked up and followed, and it appeared that in his last incarnation he had been associated with two women, mother and daughter, who had practiced witchcraft for his benefit. The younger of the two women had been for a short time his mistress. Mother and daughter had paid the penalty for their crimes, but their male partner had escaped. The diagnosis was as follows: it is the younger witch that is at the bottom of the trouble. It is her astral visits which cause the seizures of Mr. C and the nightmares of Mrs. C. And they correlate with the phases of the moon because certain phases are favorable for the operation she performs and she therefore takes advantage of them. The question now remains, is this woman in incarnation or not? That is to say, is the midnight visit paid in an astral body projected from a living human being, or by an earthbound spirit which has succeeded in evading the second death? Mrs. C. had by now been taken into the confidence of the mutual friend who was concerned for her welfare, and lent a ready ear to the suggestion that some psychic influence might be at the bottom of the trouble. For this explanation coincided with her own intuitions in the matter, intuitions she had not dared to divulge for fear of ridicule. When asked if she could identify anyone in the circle of her husband's acquaintances who might prove to be the younger witch, she replied immediately that she could without any difficulty identify both the women. And told the following curious story. The older witch she identified as her husband's mother, an aged lady who occupied a suite of rooms in their house. For this inoffensive old creature Mrs. C. had always had a peculiar horror and repulsion, although admitting there were no rational grounds for it, and honestly endeavoring to do her duty by her. So great was her horror of the old lady that she would never remain in the house after her husband had left for his office in the morning, but went out herself to her club if she had no other engagement. Among the frequenters of the house was an intimate friend of the elder Mrs. C, a woman of peculiar psychic temperament, who always called the old lady mother and was singularly attached to her. She was also very attached to Mr. C. But her feelings never exceeded, outwardly at any rate, the bounds of propriety, and Mr. C., who was sincerely attached to his own wife, never paid the slightest attention to her, looking upon her as his mother's friend, and as such to be tolerated. Mrs. C. unhesitatingly identified Miss X, as we will call her, as the younger witch. Inquiries were then made regarding her history, and a very curious story unfolded. As a young girl she had become engaged to a man who, soon after the engagement was announced, had developed galloping consumption and died after a short illness with a violent hemorrhage. Soon after this, Miss X's sister also became engaged, and by a strange fatality her lover shared the same fate, dying as died the other man, in a flood of his own blood. Years went by, and Miss X became engaged again. Soon the second lover fell ill, not, this time, with galloping consumption, but with a more lingering form of the complaint, in which hemorrhage was the principal symptom. He seemed to linger on from hemorrhage to hemorrhage, and this went on for years. Miss X, a woman of considerable private means, took a house, installed an aunt as a chaperone, and took her fiancé to live there and be nursed by her. Soon the aunt developed symptoms of illness. She appeared to be drained of all vitality and for days at a time would lie unconscious, but no specific cause was ever discovered for her illness. This peculiar menage continued for years, Miss X living in her big house with these two moribund creatures lingering on from attack to attack. She was a constant visitor at the home of the CS, both during the lifetime of Mr. C.'s first wife and that of his second, the friend of my friend. On the death of Mr. C.'s first wife she had great hopes, it was observed, that his attentions would turn towards herself, but they did not. Nevertheless she swallowed her chagrin, and succeeded in maintaining her foothold as an intimate friend of the family when the new Mrs. C. came to preside over the household. Certain methods of protection were suggested to Mrs. C., which helped her considerably, but it was not possible to exclude Miss X from the house owing to her intimacy with the old lady. In due course, however, old Mrs. C. was gathered to her fathers, and then young Mrs. C. put her foot down and said she would have no more to do with Miss X. Mr. C. concurred in this, as he had always had a repulsion for Miss X, and had only tolerated her for his mother's sake. Soon after this Mrs. C. began to feel unwell. The indisposition slowly progressed, until finally, although she had no definite symptoms, she was obliged to consult a doctor on account of her steadily increasing weakness and sense of malaise. A diagnosis of rapidly growing cancer of the womb was made. An operation was performed, which gave temporary relief. It was not expected to do any more, and she went downhill steadily. Towards the end she lapsed into unconsciousness, and at the same time, Mr. C also became unconscious, apparently having one of his seizures in sleep, from which he never awakened. They died within a few hours of each other. Mr. C.'s first wife had also died of cancer of the womb. About this time Miss X's aunt and fiancé died within a short time of each other, and the last that was heard of Miss X was that she had been removed to a nursing home in the country with a severe mental breakdown. Taken separately, any of the incidents in this strange eventful history can be explained away, but taken together they make a curious story. Especially when it is remembered that without any previous information a psychic investigation had spotted the existence of a person with abnormal faculties who was interested in Mr. C. Cancer is a disease upon which certain occult hypotheses throw a good deal of light. It is believed to be a disease of the etheric double, not of the physical body, and that a cancer elemental is the infective factor. To prove or disprove anything concerning the foregoing story is impossible, but the following occult hypothesis may explain much. If this hypothesis be not accepted, readers may find an interesting exercise for their ingenuity in constructing another that shall explain more satisfactorily the circumstances of the case. Miss X retained subconsciously the knowledge and powers that had been hers during the previous life when she was implicated in the witch cult. She also retained her passion for Mr. C. A passion which was obviously unrequited. She employed her power of projection of the astral body to visit Mr. C at night, during sleep. In the absence of details it is impossible to decide definitely whether the fit of Mr. C was a struggle or an embrace. It might be either, or it might be both, an initial struggle ending in an embrace. The dreams of Mrs. C obviously related to the same astral visitant who caused the seizures of Mr. C. There is, unfortunately, no record to show at what phase of the moon these attacks took place, but presumably at the Hecate phase, which is the period of evil witchcraft. The condition of Miss X's fiancé and aunt and the death of her first lover point markedly towards vampirism. It is difficult to believe that a consumptive would continue for so many years without his disease either being checked or making definite progress. It is difficult to say what the connection, if any, might be between Miss X and the death of her sister's lover, but it is a curious thing that 3 men, associated with this ill-omened household as prospective husbands, should lose their lives in the same way. This, together with the mysterious illness of the aunt, are very suspicious. As noted before, any one of these incidents could be explained away, but taken together they call for thought. It is also curious that Miss X should keep her fiancé in her house and yet not marry him, from every normal point of view an arrangement with many drawbacks and no advantages. On the other hand, if her feelings were fixed upon Mr. C and were obtaining satisfaction by astral visits, she would naturally not want to break her rapport with the man she loved by giving herself to the man she did not love. If she were a vampire, her motive for keeping the aunt and lover in her house, and their condition, would be readily explained. Also her breakdown, which followed immediately upon their deaths. The fact that Mr. C's first wife died of cancer of the womb does not in itself call for remark, but it is a curious thing that he should lose his second wife from the same disease. Cancer is not as common as all that, and in any case, there are many available sites beside the womb. On the other hand, Diana, one of the aspects of Luna, of whom Hecate, the goddess of witches, was another, presides over the female reproductive organs. The illness of Mrs. C began to show itself soon after Miss X was excluded from the house. Finally, what shall we say concerning the deaths of the 3 people most intimately associated with Miss X, within a short time of each other, and her immediate breakdown? In the absence of details any conclusion must be guesswork, but we have good grounds for supposing that Miss X's magical operations were attended by some mishap. It may be said that such a theory is the wildest improbability and does violence to all the laws of evidence. Let it, however, be borne in mind that 2 years before these matters eventuated, the work of a witch in connection with Mr. C.'s epileptiform attacks was suspected and the nature of her relationship to him was indicated, and subsequent inquiries revealed the curious facts in connection with Miss X's history and menage. Let it also be noted that the happenings which subsequently occurred are such as have been recorded in many accounts of witch trials. It is a scientific maxim that the power to foretell the course of phenomena is a good indication of the truth of a theory. Chapter 3. A Case of Modern Witchcraft. The part played by the X-witch in occult attack is very marked. Again and again do the investigations of independent psychics point to witchcraft in a previous incarnation when trouble of this sort is afoot. The motive is nearly always vengeance, but there is also good reason to believe that the projection of the astral body takes place involuntarily during sleep, and is not deliberately willed by the offender. Very many people who are at present psychics and sensitives got their training in the covens of medieval witchcraft, and for this reason experienced occultists are very wary of the natural psychic, as distinguished from the initiate with his technique of psychism. Where psychism and mental unbalance are found conjoined with a malevolent disposition, there is strong presumption that the cult of Diabolus is not far to seek. A curious set of happenings, in which I myself was one of the actors, throws a good deal of light on this by no means uncommon occurrence. It was in the early days of my interest in occultism, when I was still buying nay experience by the expensive but effectual method of running my head into obstacles, I made the acquaintance of a woman who was interested in psychic matters. She was a person of the most extreme sensitiveness to anything unclean or ugly, fastidious to a degree in her personal habits, living almost exclusively on uncooked vegetarian foods, even refusing eggs as too stimulating. Although not an animal lover, she was morbidly humanitarian, reading with gusto those papers which give lurid and detailed descriptions of vivisection experiments. Had I been older and wiser I should have recognized the significance of her ultra-cleanliness and ultra-sensitiveness as marking the abreaction of a sadistic temperament, sadism being a pathology of the emotional nature in which the sex instinct takes the form of an impulse to inflict pain. Not having learnt then many things which I now know, I looked upon her characteristics as indicative of an exalted spirituality. At the time I knew her she was verging on a breakdown which was alleged to be due to overwork, and she was very anxious to get away from cities and back to nature. I was just leaving London to take up my residence at an occult college which was hidden away in the sandy fastnesses of the Hampshire Barrens. In the innocence of my heart I suggested that she might come down there and help with the domestic duties. The suggestion was acted upon, and a few days after my own arrival Miss L. joined us. She seemed quite normal, made herself agreeable, and was well liked. One incident, however, in the light of subsequent events, was significant. On getting out of the ancient fly in which she had driven from the station, she immediately went and patted the still more ancient horse that drew it. That beast, usually sunk in an apathy from which he was with difficulty roused when action was required of him, galvanized into life at her touch as if she had stung him. He threw up his head, backed, snorted, and nearly turned the equipage over in the ditch, to the amazement of his Jehu, who declared he had never been known to do such a thing before, and viewed our visitor with disfavor. Miss L., however, appeared quite normal, made herself agreeable, and was given a friendly reception by the humans at any rate. That night I was awakened by nightmare, a thing to which I am not usually subject. I struggled with a weight on my chest, and even after consciousness had fully returned, the room seemed full of evil. I performed such simple banishing formula as I knew, and peace was restored. At breakfast next morning an assembly of blear-eyed people met together, complaining of having passed disturbed nights. We compared notes, and found we had all, some 6 or 7 of us, had similar nightmares, and proceeded to exchange experiences. The effect of this upon Miss L. was curious. She squirmed upon her chair as if it had suddenly become red-hot and said with much emphasis, "These things should not be discussed, it is most unwholesome." Out of deference to her feelings we desisted. But presently up to the open window came another member of our community, a woman who slept in an open-air shelter at some little distance from the house. We inquired after her health, as usual, and she replied that she was not feeling very well, as she had slept badly, and proceeded to recount the same nightmare as the rest of us. Later on in the morning, another lady, who had a house a little way down the road, arrived, and she in her turn told of a similar nightmare. These nightmares continued, on and off for the next few days, to afflict different members of the community. They were vague and nebulous, and there was nothing we could pitch upon for diagnostic purposes, and we put it down to indigestion caused by the village baker's version of war bread. Then one day I had a quarrel with Miss L. She had conceived a crush for me. I have a constitutional repulsion for crushes and give them scant politeness, and she complained bitterly of my lack of responsiveness. Whatever may be the rights and wrongs of the case, I had roused her resentment in good earnest. That night I was afflicted with the most violent nightmare I have ever had in my life, waking from sleep with the terrible sense of oppression on my chest, as if someone were holding me down, or lying upon me. I saw distinctly the head of Miss L. reduced to the size of an orange, floating in the air at the foot of my bed, and snapping its teeth at me. It was the most malignant thing I have ever seen. Still not attaching any psychic significance to my experiences, and being firmly convinced that the local baker was responsible, I told no one of my dream, thinking it one of those things that are better kept to oneself. But when the members of the community came to talk matters over in the light of subsequent events, we found that 2 other people had had similar experiences. A night or 2 later, however, as it came to bedtime, I was overcome with a sense of impending evil, as if something dangerous were lurking in the bushes around the house threatening attack. So strong was this sensation that I came down from my room and went all round the house, testing the catches of the windows to make sure that all was secure. Miss L. heard me, and called out to know what I was doing. I told her of my feelings. "You silly child," she said, "it is no use latching the windows, the danger is not outside the house but in it. Go to bed, and be sure and lock your door." She would give no answer to my questions except to reiterate that I should lock my door. This was the first night I had slept in that house, previously having been in a cottage on the opposite side of the road. I did not lock my door because the night was intolerably hot and the room and the window small. I compromised, however, by putting an enamel slop pail at a strategic spot in the fairway, trusting that any intruder would fall over it and give the alarm. Nothing happened, and I slept quietly. Next morning, however, the storm broke. Miss L. and I were peacefully at work in the kitchen when she suddenly caught up a carving knife and started after me, as mad as a March hare. Fortunately for me I had in my hands a large saucepan full of freshly boiled greens, and I used this as a weapon of defense, and we danced round the kitchen table, slopping hot cabbage water in all directions. We neither of us made a sound. I fended her off with the hot and sooty saucepan, and she slashed at me with an unpleasantly large carving knife. At a psychological moment in walked the head of the community. He took in the situation at a glance, and handled it by the tactful method of scolding us both impartially for making so much noise and telling us to get on with our work. Miss L. finished whatever she was doing with the carver, I dished up the cabbage, and the incident passed off quietly. After lunch Miss L. experienced the reaction from her excitement and went to her room completely prostrated with exhaustion. I was somewhat perturbed. Although used to mental cases, and therefore not as disturbed by the recent fracas as anyone else might have been, I did not relish the prospect of being the housemaid of a dangerous lunatic who was under no sort of control. The head of the community, however, said there was no cause for alarm, he would soon have the case in hand. He went up to the bathroom, filled a soap dish with water from the tap, made certain passes over it, and dipping his finger in the water, proceeded to draw a 5-pointed star upon the threshold of Miss L.'s room. Miss L. made no attempt to leave her room until 48 hours later when he fetched her out himself. As he had promised, he soon had her in hand. He had several long talks with her, at which I was not present, and at the end of a few days a very chastened Miss L. began to go about her household duties again. There were relapses, and there were struggles, but in the course of a few weeks she became comparatively normal, and when I met her again some 18 months later there had been no relapse. Two curious incidents occurred during the period of her treatment at the hands of this man, an adept if ever there was one. The house in which she had a room was a very old one, and the front door exceedingly massive. It was secured at night by two enormous bolts that extended right across it, a chain that could have moored a barge, and a huge lock with a key the size of a trowel. When the door was opened in the morning it acted as an alarm clock for the entire village. It creaked, it groaned, and it clanged. Yet night after night we came down in the morning to find this door standing ajar. We all slept with our doors open on to the small landing. To go down the ancient, creaking stairs was like walking on organ stops. The back door was a modern affair, which could have been opened easily. The windows were modern casements of the most gimcrack description. Who opened the heavy front door, and why? We exchanged recriminations several mornings at break-fast as to who had left the door open the night before, but no one could ever be convicted of the blame. Finally the matter came to the knowledge of the head of the group. "I will soon put a stop to that," he said, and each night he resealed Miss L's room with the pentagram. We had no more trouble with the front door coming open after that. While he was dealing with Miss L, he made a practice of sealing the threshold of his own room in the same way, only in this case he drew the pentagram point outwards, to prevent Miss D from coming in. Whereas when he sealed her room, he put its point inwards, to prevent her coming out. She did not know this, nor was it likely to reach her ears indirectly, for he was very uncommunicative. I only knew that he was sealing his room because I chanced to see him doing it. Nevertheless, one day I heard a knock at my door, and there was Miss L, with her arms full of clean linen. She asked me if I would be good enough to take it into the room of the head of the community, and put it away. I asked her why she did not do so herself, for I knew he was out, and it was her work to put away the linen. She replied that she had been to his room for that purpose, but there was a psychic barrier across the threshold that prevented her entering. She also asked me, on several occasions, to put inside my frock out of sight a little silver cross that I habitually wore, as she said she could not bear the sight of it. This cross I had purchased just before coming to this occult college, and had taken it to a priest of my acquaintance to be blessed, for I had not been altogether easy in my mind concerning the nature of the group I was joining. And during the early days of my association with it was poised on tiptoe, as it were, ready for instant flight. Naturally I had kept my own counsel concerning the psychic precautions I had taken against my new friends, and no one was aware that the cross had been specially magnetized against psychic attack. Nevertheless, the woman who would have attacked if she could, felt its influence and feared it. Autosuggestion and imagination play so large a part in so-called psychic impressions that one is chary of accepting confirmatory testimony from a psychic who knows what is expected of him, but a spontaneous reaction is in my opinion evidential. When the treatment of Miss L had progressed some way towards her final recovery, much interesting information was elicited. She told us that she had distinct memories of dealings with black magic in her previous lives. This, she said, had been confirmed by several independent psychics, and I would certainly have been willing to add my testimony to theirs had I been asked. As a child, she used to daydream that she was a witch, willing the death or misfortune of those who annoyed her, and she also averred, though whether this was true or not I cannot say, that her wishes were so effectual that she was frightened and tried to abandon the practice. She also volunteered that she was in the habit of visualizing herself standing before people she was angry with, scolding them, and projecting malignant force at them. This, of course, would explain our nightmares. She also said that she had been in the habit of attacking her mother and sister in this way, and had made her sister very ill, so that they now refused to have her in the house. This statement was later confirmed by the mother. She told us that she felt as if she were two distinct persons, her normal self being spiritually minded, intensely compassionate and idealistic. Her other, and lower self, which came to the surface when she was crossed, upset, or overtired, being intensely malicious and subject to paroxysms of hate and cruelty. These characteristics had been particularly marked when she was little. But as she grew older she recognized the wrongfulness of them, and her lofty idealism represented her endeavor to rise above them. This endeavor was, I am convinced, an honest one. Unfortunately it was not always successful. She referred to the incident in which she told me to lock my door, and said she had done so in the hope of affording me some measure of protection against the astral projection in which she knew she was tempted to indulge. At first sight her case had looked like one of obsession, and had been so diagnosed by one or two members of the community, but wise handling revealed otherwise. This case reveals another interesting point in that, true to the witch tradition, she had a horror of sacred symbols. She would not occupy a room where there was a picture of a religious subject. Nothing would induce her to wear any piece of jewelry in the form of a cross, and it was impossible for her to enter a church. This case has many points of interest, especially in the fact that what was apparently a case of well-marked insanity was cleared up by occult methods. Chapter 4. Projection of the etheric body. Before we can leave the subject of attack by incarnate human beings, we must consider the subject of etheric projection. In this case not only is the mind at work, but also something which is pretty nearly physical. Sufficiently physical, at any rate, to leave bruises on the flesh of the victim, throw the furniture about, or at least make a considerable amount of noise. Where such manifestations take place, it is obvious that we are dealing with something more substantial than the mind, for although mind can influence mind, and through it the body to an extent to which in the present state of our knowledge it is difficult to set limits, mind cannot manipulate matter directly, that is to say, you cannot smash a window by means of a thought. There must be some physical vehicle that can be manipulated by the mind if effects are to be wrought on the physical plane. The living body is such an instrument. It is manipulated by the mind every time a voluntary movement takes place. And the operations of spiritual healing are simply an extension of this principle to the involuntary muscles and physiological processes not ordinarily directed by the conscious mind. Occultists maintain that mind affects body by means of the etheric double, as it is called, the immortal mind, of the Christian Scientists. We may not unreasonably conclude that when physical action is produced at a distance by occult means, it is done by employing this etheric double. The etheric double is primarily a body of magnetic stresses in the framework of whose meshes every cell and fiber of the physical body is held as in a rack. But intermediate between this and the dense physical body as we know it, there is what may be called the raw material out of which dense matter is condensed. This was called by the ancients, hyle, or first matter, and by the moderns, ectoplasm. It is this projected ectoplasm which produces the phenomena whenever physical manifestations are in question. It may be projected as long rods, which will operate up to a distance of a dozen feet or so. Or it may be projected as a nebulous cloud, connected with the medium by a tenuous thread. This cloud can be organized into distinct forms, having the semblance of life and acting as vehicles for conscious wills. There is a great deal of information available on this subject in the literature of spiritualism, to which reference may be found in the bibliography at the end of this book. The adept who was head of the occult college to which I have previously referred, and from whom I received my first training in occultism, was able to perform this operation, and I have many times seen him do it. He would go into deep trance, after a few convulsive movements, somewhat like a slow tebny, and would then lose about 2/3 of his weight. I have many times helped to lift him, or even lifted him single-handed, when he was in this state, and he weighed no more than a child. A man can fake many things, but he cannot fake his weight. I have lifted him single-handed from the floor on to a sofa when in this state. It is quite true that, being rigid as a board, he was much easier to handle than the ordinary limp, unconscious human form. But there is a certain ratio between the weight of a grown man and the strength of a woman of average physique. What became of the missing weight on these occasions I found out one night. He had been ill, with some delirium, and the lion's share of the nursing, especially the night work, had fallen to my lot. There came a time, however, when we decided that he was so far recovered that it was unnecessary for anyone to sit up with him, so to bed we all went, for the first time for several days. I shared a room with another member of the community. It was a comparatively small cottage we were in, and our two beds were close together, side by side, right under the uncurtained open window. It was the time of the full moon, and I remember that I had no need to light a candle in order to see to undress. I fell asleep at once, for I was very tired. I could not have been asleep very long, however, when I was awakened by the sensation of a weight upon my feet. It was as if a good-sized dog, say, a collie, had jumped up and lain down on the bed. The room was flooded with moonlight, and as bright as day, and I clearly saw, lying apparently asleep across the foot of my bed, the man whom we had left safely tucked up for the night in the room below. It was a somewhat embarrassing situation, and I lay still, taking thought before I did anything. I was wide enough awake by now, as may well be imagined. I concluded that Z, as I will call this man, had either had a return of the delirium, or was sleepwalking. In any case, I was very anxious to get him safely back to bed again without a fuss or a scene. My companion had a bad heart, and I did not want her to get a shock, neither did I want him to get a shock in his weak state. I was afraid that if I waked my roommate first, she might scream, and wake Z up with a start, with disastrous consequences. I decided therefore to wake him gently, as being the worst case of the two, and let her take her chance. Having cogitated these matters for several moments at least, I finally took action. I sat up in bed and leant quietly forward with the intention of touching him gently on the shoulder and so arousing him. In order to lean forward, I had to withdraw my feet from under him, for they were pinned by his weight, which until now had rested upon them, for I had been careful not to stir while thinking out my plan of campaign. Z was plainly visible in the moonlight, clad apparently in his dressing gown, or so I took the muffling folds of material to be that swathed him about. Both his face and wrappings appeared grey and colourless in the moonlight, but there was no question in my mind as to his solidarity, for not only could I see him, but I could feel his weight resting upon my feet. But the moment I moved, he vanished, and I was left staring in amazement at the smooth fold of the blankets over the end of the little camp bed on which I lay. It was then, and then only, that I realized he had appeared all grey and colourless, more like a shaded pencil sketch than a human being of flesh and blood. I asked him about this incident in the morning, but he said he had no recollection of it. He had been dreaming the uneasy, broken dreams of a sick man, but could not recall them. This, of course, was in no way an occult attack, but rather the visit of a friend, who had come to lean upon me in the course of his illness, and instinctively came to me for consolation when out of his body in trance at a time when his weakened condition prevented him from retaining his normal control over his psychic activities. Nevertheless, it serves to illustrate what could be done if the etheric form that visited me had been energized by a malignant will. It may explain the nature of the sense of weight that oppresses the victims of a certain type of nightmare. I have heard of more than one case wherein bruises resembling finger marks were found on the throats of people who had been victims of an astral attack. I have never actually seen such bruises myself, but I have been told of them by people who have either had them themselves, or seen them. It is a well-known fact that if an occultist, functioning out of the body, meets with unpleasantness on the astral plane, or if his subtle body is seen, and struck or shot at, the physical body will show the marks. I myself have many times found curiously patterned bruises on my body after an astral skirmish. The mechanism of the production of such marks must, I think, be of the same nature as that which produces the stigmata of saints and the curious physical marks and swellings sometimes seen in hysterics. The mind, powerfully stirred, affects the etheric double, and the etheric double acts upon the physical molecules held in its meshes. I dare to prophesy the next advances in medicine will be bound up with the knowledge of the nature and function of the etheric double. The next type of psychic attack which we must consider is that conducted by means of artificial elementals. These are distinguished from thought forms by the fact that, once formulated by the creative mind of the magician, they possess a distinct and independent life of their own, though strictly conditioned as to nature by the concept of their creator. The life of these creatures is akin to that of an electric battery. It slowly leaks out by means of radiation, and unless recharged periodically, will finally weaken and die out. The whole question of the making, charging, recharging, or destruction of these artificial elementals is an important one in practical occultism. The artificial elemental is constructed by forming a clear, cut image in the imagination of the creature it is intended to create, and souling it with something of the corresponding aspect of one's own being, and then invoking into it the appropriate natural force. This method can be used for good as well as evil, and guardian angels are formed in this way. It is said that dying women, anxious concerning the welfare of their children, frequently form them unconsciously. I myself once had an exceedingly nasty experience in which I formulated a werewolf accidentally. Unpleasant as the incident was, I think it may be just as well to give it publicity, for it shows what may happen when an insufficiently disciplined and purified nature is handling occult forces. I had received serious injury from someone who, at considerable cost to myself, I had disinterestedly helped, and I was sorely tempted to retaliate. Lying on my bed resting one afternoon, I was brooding over my resentment, and while so brooding, drifted towards the borders of sleep. There came to my mind the thought of casting off all restraints and going berserk. The ancient Nordic myths rose before me, and I thought of Fenris, the wolf horror of the north. Immediately I felt a curious drawing out sensation from my solar plexus, and there materialized beside me on the bed a large wolf. It was a well-materialized ectoplasmic form. Like Z, it was gray and colorless, and like him, it had weight. I could distinctly feel its back pressing against me as it lay beside me on the bed as a large dog might. I knew nothing about the art of making elementals at that time, but had accidentally stumbled upon the right method, the brooding highly charged with emotion, the invocation of the appropriate natural force, and the condition between sleeping and waking in which the etheric double readily extrudes. I was horrified at what I had done, and knew I was in a tight corner and that everything depended upon my keeping my head. I had had enough experience of practical occultism to know that the thing I had called into visible manifestation could be controlled by my will provided I did not panic. But that if I lost my nerve and it got the upper hand, I had a Frankenstein monster to cope with. I stirred slightly, and the creature evidently objected to being disturbed, for it turned its long snout towards me over its shoulder, and snarled, showing its teeth. I had now got the wind up properly. But I knew that everything depended on my getting the upper hand and keeping it, and that the best thing I could do was to fight it out now, because the longer the thing remained in existence, the stronger it would get, and the more difficult to disintegrate. So I drove my elbow into its hairy ectoplasmic ribs and said to it out loud, "If you can't behave yourself, you will have to go on the floor," and pushed it off the bed. Down it went, meek as a lamb, and changed from wolf to dog, to my great relief. Then the northern corner of the room appeared to fade away, and the creature went out through the gap. I was far from happy, however, for I had a feeling that this was not the end of it, and my feeling was confirmed when next morning another member of my household reported that her sleep had been disturbed by dreams of wolves, and she had awakened in the night to see the eyes of a wild animal shining in the darkness in the corner of her room. Now thoroughly alarmed, I went off to seek advice from one whom I have always looked upon as my teacher, and I was told that I had made this thing out of my own substance by revengeful thoughts, and that it was really a part of myself extruded, and that I must at all costs recall it and reabsorb it into myself, at the same time foregoing my desire to settle accounts with the person who had injured me. Curiously enough, just at this time there came an opportunity most effectually to settle with my antagonist. Fortunately for all concerned, I had enough sense left to see that I was at the dividing of the ways, and if I were not careful would take the first step onto the left-hand path. If I availed myself of the opportunity to give practical expression to my resentment, the wolf form would be born into an independent existence, and there would be the devil to pay, literally as well as metaphorically. I received the distinct impression, and impressions are important things in psychic matters, for they often represent subconscious knowledge and experience, that once the wolf impulse had found expression in action, the wolf form would sever the psychic navel cord that connected it with my solar plexus, and it would be no longer possible for me to absorb it. The prospect was not a pleasant one. I had to forego my dearly loved revenge and allow harm to be done to me without defending myself, and I also had to summon and absorb a wolf form which, to my psychic consciousness at any rate, looked unpleasantly tangible. Nor was it a situation in which I could either ask for assistance nor expect much sympathy. However, it had to be faced, and I knew that with every hour of the thing's existence it would be harder to deal with, so I made the resolution to let the opportunity for revenge slip through my fingers, and at first dusk summoned the creature. It came in through the northern corner of the room again. Subsequently I learnt that the north was considered among the ancients as the evil quarter, and presented itself upon the hearthrug in quite a mild and domesticated mood. I obtained an excellent materialization in the half-light, and could have sworn that a big Alsatian was standing there looking at me. It was tangible, even to the dog-like odor. From it to me stretched a shadowy line of ectoplasm. One end was attached to my solar plexus, and the other disappeared in the shaggy fur of its belly, but I could not see the actual point of attachment. I began by an effort of the will and imagination to draw the life out of it along this silver cord, as if sucking lemonade up a straw. The wolf form began to fade, the cord thickened and grew more substantial. A violent emotional upheaval started in myself. I felt the most furious impulses to go berserk and rend and tear anything and anybody that came to hand, like the Malay running amok. I conquered this impulse with an effort, and the upheaval subsided. The wolf form had now faded into a shapeless grey mist. This too absorbed along the silver cord. The tension relaxed and I found myself bathed in perspiration. That, as far as I know, was the end of the incident. I had had a sharp lesson, and a highly instructive one. It may not be convincing to other people, owing to the lack of corroborative evidence, but it was exceedingly evidential to me, and I put it on record for what it is worth to those who, having personal knowledge of these things, can see its significance. It is a curious point that, during the brief 24 hours of the thing's life, the opportunity for an effectual vengeance presented itself. Chapter 5. Vampirism. The alleged vampire has always been a popular character in tales of mystery and imagination. There is a considerable literature concerning his doings, from the famous novel Dracula to serious studies of the medieval witch trials, for which the reader is referred to the bibliography at the end of the book. In these pages, however, I do not want to avail myself of second-hand evidence, nor of incidents which took place in other centuries and under primitive conditions, for it might be argued that with the passing of such conditions from our midst, the problem of vampirism, like the problem of typhus, has gone too, and need not trouble us. From my own experience I am of the opinion, however, that this is not so, and that the peculiar condition which the ancients called vampirism may account for certain forms of mental disturbance and the physical ill health associated therewith. When psychoanalysis was first introduced into England I took up the subject, and became a student, and eventually a lecturer at a clinic that was founded in London. We students were soon struck by the fact that some cases were exceedingly exhausting to deal with. It was not that they were troublesome, but simply that they took it out of us, and left us feeling like limp rags at the end of a treatment. Someone happened to mention this fact to one of the nurses engaged in the electrical department. And she told us that the same patients equally took it out of the electrical machines and that they could absorb the most surprising voltages without turning a hair. At the same place, in the course of my psychoanalytical work, I came across a number of cases where a morbid attachment existed between two people, most commonly mother and daughter, or two women friends. Sometimes also between mother and son, and in one case I met socially, between a man and a woman. It was always the negative one of the pair who came for treatment, and we were able to benefit them considerably by psychotherapeutic means. They always showed the same symptom complex, a sensitive temperament, pallid complexion, wasted form and general debility, sense of weakness, and easy fatigability. They were also invariably highly suggestible, and were therefore easy to handle. Consequently we were usually able to get good results pretty quickly in such cases. The curious point, however, was that the breaking of the morbid rapport caused a marked disturbance and even semi-collapse of the dominant partner in the alliance. We found it necessary to insist upon a separation if a cure were to be effected, and the separation invariably disagreed very actively with the dominant partner. At that time I explained everything in terms of the Freudian psychology, but even so, I could not help being struck by the curious effect a separation had upon the person who was not supposed to be ill, and that as the one went uphill, the other went down. I am of the opinion that what Freud calls an Oedipus complex is not altogether a one-sided affair, and that the soul of the parent is drawing upon the psychic vitality of the child. It is curious how aged Oedipus cases always look, and what little old men and women they are as children. They never have a normal childhood, but always are mentally mature for their years. I persuaded various patients to show me photographs of themselves as children, and was much struck by the elderly, worried expression of the childish faces, as if they had known all of life's problems and burdens. Knowing what we do of telepathy and the magnetic aura, it appears to me not unreasonable to suppose that in some way which we do not as yet fully understand, the negative partner of such a rapport is shorting on to the positive partner. There is a leakage of vitality going on, and the dominant partner is more or less consciously lapping it up, if not actually sucking it out. Such cases are by no means uncommon, and clear up rapidly when the victim is separated from the vampire. Whenever there is a record of a close and dominating bond between two people with the devitalization of one of them, it is a good plan to recommend a temporary separation and observe the results. Such cases as these, however, may more justly be described as parasitism than vampirism. Such psychic parasitism is exceedingly common, and explains many psychological problems. We will not pursue the subject in these pages, however, as it is outside the scope of our present inquiry, and is merely mentioned for illustrative purposes. Vampirism, as generally understood, is a very different matter, and we shall do well to reserve the term for those cases wherein the attack is deliberate, applying the term parasitism to the cases wherein it is unconscious and involuntary. In my opinion, true vampirism cannot take place unless there is power to project the etheric double. All the records of vampirism that we have given account of something much more tangible than a haunting. In Western Europe the occurrence seems to be comparatively rare in modern times, but in Eastern Europe and in primitive countries it appears to be by no means uncommon, and innumerable well-authenticated cases occur in books of travel. Commander Gould, in his exceedingly interesting book, Oddities, gives an account of vampirism among the Berberlangs of the Philippine Islands. His account is based on a paper printed in the Journal of the Asiatic Society, Volume 65, 1896. These unpleasant people, according to Mr. Skirchley, the author of the article which Commander Gould quotes, are ghouls, and must eat human flesh occasionally or they would die. When they feel a craving for a meal of human flesh they go away into the grass, and having carefully hidden their bodies, hold their breaths and fall into a trance. Their astral bodies are then liberated. They fly away, and entering a house, make their way into the body of one of the occupants and feed on his entrails. The Berberlangs may be heard coming, as they make a moaning noise, which is loud at a distance and dies away to a feeble moan as they approach. When they are near you, the sound of their wings may be heard, and the flashing lights of their eyes can be seen dancing like fireflies in the dark. Mr. Skirchley declares that he himself saw and heard a flight of Berberlangs pass by, and visiting next day the house he saw them enter, found the occupant dead without any sign of external violence. Compare Mr. Skirchley's account of the Berberlangs lying in the long grass and throwing themselves into trance with Mr. Muldoon's account of the projection of the astral body, with which every student of occultism ought to be familiar, for it is undoubtedly a classic of occult literature. Being a practical account of occult experiences and detailed instructions how to go and do likewise. But to return nearer home. In the course of my experience of the byways of the human mind, which, from the nature of my work, has been, like Sam Weller's knowledge of London, extensive and peculiar, I have only known one case of genuine vampirism. According to the sense in which I use the term, and this was not one of my own cases, though I knew the persons concerned, but was handled by my original teacher, whom I have already referred to in connection with the case of the good lady who chased me with a carving knife. I have made use of the facts of this case as a groundwork for one of the stories in The Secrets of Dr. Taverner, but the actual facts are such that they were unsuitable for a work supposedly designed to amuse. At that time I was doing the tutorials in abnormal psychology at the clinic I have spoken of, and supervising the work of the other students. One of them took counsel with me concerning a case that had come to her in private practice, the case of a youth in the late teens. One of those degenerate but intellectual and socially presentable types that not infrequently crop up in old families whose blood is too blue to be wholesome. This lad was taken as boarder in a flat which the student shared with another woman, and they soon began to be troubled with curious phenomena. About the same time every evening the dogs in a neighboring mews began a furious outcry of barking and howling, and a few moments later the French window leading on to the veranda would open. It did not matter how often they got the locksmith to it, nor how they barricaded it, open it would come at the appointed time, and a cold draught sweep through the flat. This phenomenon took place one evening when the adept, Z, was present, and he declared that an unpleasant invisible entity had entered. They lowered the lights, and were able to see a dull glow in the corner he indicated, and when they put their hands into this glow, felt a tingling sensation such as is experienced when the hands are put into electrically charged water. Then began a mighty spook hunt up and down the flat, and the presence was finally cornered and dispatched in the bathroom. I have staged the incident somewhat more picturesquely in my story, but the essential facts are the same. The result of the dispatching of this entity was a marked improvement in the condition of the boy patient, and the elicitation of the following story. The boy, whom we will call D, was in the habit of going to sit with a cousin who had been invalid home from France suffering from alleged shell shock. This young man was another scion of a worn-out stock, and it transpired that he had been caught red-handed in that unpleasant perversion called necrophilia. According to the story elicited from the parents of D, this vice was not uncommon on certain sections of the front, as were also attacks on wounded men. The authorities were taking drastic steps to put it down. Owing to family influence, the cousin of D was able to escape incarceration in a military prison, and was placed in the care of his family as a mental case, and they put him in the charge of a male nurse. It was while the male nurse was off duty that the unfortunate young D was misguidedly employed to sit with him. It also came out that the relations between D and his cousin were of a vicious nature, and on one occasion he bit the boy on the neck, just under the ear, actually drawing blood. D had always been under the impression that some ghost attacked him during his crises, but had not dared to say so for fear of being thought mad. What may have been the exact percentages of neurotic taint, vice, and psychic attack, it is difficult to say, nor is it easy to decide which was the predisposing cause that opened the door to all the trouble. But one thing stood out clearly to all beholders, that with the dispatch of the psychic visitant, not only did D.'s condition clear up immediately, but after a short, sharp upheaval the cousin also recovered. The method of dispatch used by the adept, Z, was to pin the entity inside a magic circle, so that it could not get away, and then absorb it into himself through compassion. As he completed the operation, he fell over backwards unconscious. It was, in fact, the same method that I was instructed to use in dealing with my werewolf, but it is a much more formidable task to absorb and transmute the projection of another person than to absorb one's own, and could only have been accomplished by an initiate of a very high grade, which Z indubitably was. His opinion concerning the case, though there was no means of obtaining independent confirmation of this, was that some Eastern European troops had been brought to the Western Front. And among these were individuals with the traditional knowledge of black magic for which Southeastern Europe has always enjoyed a sinister reputation among occultists. These men, getting killed, knew how to avoid going to the second death, that is to say, the disintegration of the astral body, and maintain themselves in the etheric double by vampirising the wounded. Now vampirism is contagious. The person who is vampirized, being depleted of vitality, is a psychic vacuum, himself absorbing from anyone he comes across in order to refill his depleted resources of vitality. He soon learns by experience the tricks of a vampire without realizing their significance, and before he knows where he is a full-blown vampire himself, vampirising others. The earthbound soul of a vampire sometimes attaches itself permanently to one individual if it succeeds in making a functioning vampire of him, systematically drawing its etheric nutriment from him, for since he in his turn is resupplying himself from others, he will not die from exhaustion as victims of vampires do in the ordinary way. Z was of the opinion that D's cousin was not the primary vampire in the case, but was himself a victim. Being a youth of unstable morale, he speedily acquired the vampire tricks, and the earthbound soul of some Magyar magician exploited him. Through his act of biting and drawing blood from the neck of his cousin, this entity became transferred to young D, preferring pastures new to the depleted resources of its previous victim. Probably it alternated between the two, for it was not constantly with D. Exactly what Z did we do not know, for he was exceedingly secretive concerning his methods, but in the light of subsequent knowledge I should imagine that he absorbed the etheric energy of the earthbound soul, and thus deprived it of its means of resisting the second death. Merely to drive the resisting soul out to the judgment hall of Osiris would have involved leaving behind an astral corpse, which for some time would have continued to give trouble. It may be interesting to note in connection with this case that during the time that Miss L was at the occult college in Hampshire we had some rather curious happenings. There was an outbreak among us of exceedingly bad mosquito bites. The bites themselves were not poisonous, but the stabs were of such a nature that they bled freely. I remember waking up one morning to find a patch of blood the size of the palm of my hand on the pillow. It had apparently come from a small puncture just behind the angle of the jaw. Several others had similar experiences. I have never seen anything like it either before or since, nor did it occur again after Miss L left. I did not tell the adept Z about it at the time, and later, when I was reminded of the incident and mentioned it, the opportunity for investigation had gone by. He expressed the opinion that it was a vampire's work, and cited similar cases which he had met with in the course of his experience. He said he had seen cases in Africa where the victim had become so bloodless that it was with difficulty that a specimen of blood could be obtained for examination, for it could hardly be induced to flow from the debilitated tissues. Nothing can be done for such cases by medical science. They are dying by inches, and yet no organic disease can be demonstrated. Nevertheless, their appearance is that of a person sinking from repeated hemorrhages. When vampirism is suspected, the thing to do is to go over that person's body inch by inch with a powerful magnifying glass, and the search will probably be rewarded by the discovery of numerous minute punctures. So minute that they are not discovered by an examination with the naked eye unless they reveal themselves by becoming infected and suppurating, when they are usually mistaken for insect bites. They are bites right enough, but not those of an insect. The places to look for them are around the neck, especially under the ears, down the inner surface of the forearms, on the lobes of the ears, about the tips of the toes and, in a woman, upon the breasts. It is said that a person with vampire tendencies develops abnormally long and sharp canine teeth, and I have myself seen one such case, and a curious sight it was. The two canine teeth, the pair that come between the incisors and the double teeth, were half as long again as the others, and terminated in points of needle-like sharpness. True vampirism in Western Europe appears to be rare, but Z was of the opinion that many obscure cases of tropical debility in which anemia played a prominent part, might be attributed to this cause. Chapter 6. Hauntings. There are two forms of haunting which have to be considered, the one which is due to a discarnate soul who interferes with a particular person, and the one which is due to the conditions prevailing in a particular place, and which affects any person sufficiently sensitive who happens to go there. Except in cases where the influence is exceptionally strong, the insensitive person is immune. To perceive a haunting, one needs, as a general rule, to be slightly psychic. It is for this reason that children, Celts and the colored races suffer severely from such interferences, and the stolid Nordic type is comparatively immune, and, to a lesser extent, the lively, materialistic and skeptical Latin. Let us consider first of all the question of interference by a discarnate soul. It will be noted that I use the term interference and not attack. The disturbance need not necessarily be an attack, any more than the drowning man who clings to his rescuer and drags him under is motived by malice. The entity that is causing the trouble may be a soul that is itself in distress on the inner planes, and is too ignorant of post-mortem conditions to know the harm it is doing by clinging so desperately to the living. It is for this reason that the wide dissemination of spiritualistic teachings is of value, for it helps to relieve the tension between this world and the next. As far as my experience goes, I am inclined to think that deliberate malevolence is rare. But this panic-stricken clinging is not uncommon, and explains why the survivor of a pair sometimes goes through very unpleasant experiences after the death of the partner. There are also cases, though rarer, wherein a soul who has some occult knowledge but is bound strongly to earth by sensual desires, uses a curious form of rapport in order to gratify those desires through the physical body of another. There are innumerable instances of both these types of astral interference in occult and spiritualistic literature, but as I am confining myself to cases within my own experience, I will not cite them, but limit myself to listing the literature of the subject in the bibliography. Someone of my acquaintance lost, after a long illness, her husband to whom she was much attached, but whom most people would have thought she was well rid of, as for many years he had been addicted to drink. And died finally after a long illness during which he was kept under morphia for prolonged periods, taking enormous quantities. He was a man of intensely malignant and selfish disposition, and died unrepentant. She, however, during the course of his last illness, when, being bedridden, he could do no more harm, elected to idolize him, and as soon as he was safely dead, canonized him into the family saint. She was interested in occultism and in the habit of practicing meditation and invoking the masters. In spite of all counsel to the contrary, she began to try and get into psychic touch with her husband, invoking him as her guide. Like many other men of a sensual disposition, he had clung desperately to life, remaining in articulo mortis for days. Fortunately for all concerned, it had been possible to persuade her to have his remains cremated, but despite all persuasion she brought all his belongings from the nursing home where he had died and kept them in her bedroom, and made a little altar around his photograph and used it as the focus of her meditations. The last illness had been a long and trying one, and she had been living at the end of a telephone wire, in a state of constant anxiety for weeks, but had had no physical strain. So there was nothing physical to account for the serious illness which ensued after the strain was over. It soon became noticeable that she, who had previously had a very lovable and gentle disposition, was gradually changing, so that not only in temperament, but in facial expression, she was growing like her late husband. Next a curious thing ensued. Her husband had died of an inflammatory spinal lesion which caused no pain at the site of the trouble, but intense pain in the nerves that issued from the spine at that point. So that the pain was referred to a particular distribution in the hands and arms, more upon one side than the other. This lady developed a severe neuritis that exactly corresponded in its distribution to her late husband's symptoms. Another illustrative case is that of Miss E., whose fiancé was killed during the war. She says in a letter written to the person whom she consulted with regard to her problem, "I was able to rise above the loss and separation at the time, but 6 months later I suffered nervous breakdown. From this time I have been troubled with weak nerves. For the last 2 months I have been having very extraordinary experiences which are causing me much perplexity and rendering me unfit for work. It is a night experience and has not once occurred during the day. After I have composed myself for sleep I find that gradually my body is losing all sensation, it feels as if I was being slowly frozen stiff. I don't know how else to describe it. At this stage I can sometimes rouse myself and overcome it, but I cannot always do this. My efforts to rouse myself are in vain, and although fully conscious I feel unable to move or call. Usually after this I sink into some kind of sleep. I have all kinds of experiences. Sometimes I visit strange places and talk with people I don't know. Sometimes my experiences are beautiful beyond description. Sometimes I am threatened with danger of drowning or falling, but in these cases I always rise in the air and travel for miles, it seems to me. Sometimes I feel that I am just floating in the air. How long the dream lasts I cannot tell. When I wake up, however, I have great difficulty in moving for some time. But gradually I regain the power to move about, and after a lot of stinging sensation in the limbs I get up, usually feeling very tired and unrefreshed, but sometimes I feel none the worse for the strange experience. But it is undermining my health and happiness, and it cannot be good. In conversation she amplified the statements in her letter, and said that during the experiences described, someone, she thought it was her fiancé, was trying to prevent her from getting back into her body again after these nocturnal expeditions. The case was entirely cleared up in 1 week by means of telepathic treatment. The notes on the manner in which the work was done are of considerable interest. The treatment was given to the entity that was causing the trouble, not merely to the patient, and it was the release of the obsessor from his plane of work and helping him heavenward that gave freedom to his victim. In the other type of haunting, that in which it is the place which is the focus of manifestation, not a special person, we must distinguish between the earth-bound entity which remains attached to a particular spot, and the thought atmosphere which is left behind after violent emotions have been experienced there. Let us consider first the question of thought atmosphere, of which I can give a very illuminating example. A friend of mine who was a student at a school of dramatic art consulted me concerning an attack of stage fright she had had, which left her rather nervous as to its recurrence. She was an experienced student, in fact a pupil teacher, and she was having some extra tuition from the head of the school. Going for her lesson one afternoon, she found that her teacher had just finished taking the junior students for their end-of-the-term examination in elocution. She went on to the stage and stood beside the small table which had been placed there for the convenience of the examiner, and commenced to recite the piece on which she was to have her lesson. She herself had no occasion for nervousness. As had already been noted, she was an experienced speaker and teacher. Moreover, nothing of importance hung upon this lesson, it was merely one of a series. Nor was she usually nervous or self-conscious. But as soon as she tried to start, she experienced a complete dry-up, and stood paralyzed, unable to utter a word. A little prompting soon started her off, however, but she had experienced a nasty attack of stage fright, and it shook her nerve. From the psychic point of view, the explanation was not far to seek. She was standing in the mental atmosphere created by a series of girls who had gone on to that platform for an examination upon which a good deal depended for them, and who had all been correspondingly nervous. She herself, being sensitive, had been affected by this atmosphere, which induced in her a similar mental state by means of which is called sympathetic induction, a phenomenon well known in electricity and in acoustics, but equally valid in psychology. No doubt the unfortunate examinees themselves were infecting each other. It may well be that the microphone panic, so well known to broadcasters, is caused by the thought atmosphere generated by a succession of nervous people who have stood upon the same spot. An experience of my own may be of interest in this connection. I took a bed-sitting room in a hostel, and as soon as I came there, I found myself afflicted with the most intense depression. I am not usually subject to the blues, being normally a cheerful soul, but as soon as I entered this room, which was a sunny and pleasant one, the cloud descended upon me, but lifted again as soon as I went out of it. Whether into the dining room of the hostel, or out of doors. I soon recognized that here was something that needed to be dealt with, and inquired as to the history of the room. I was told that it had previously been the bedroom of the last owner of the house, who had been addicted to drink and had gone bankrupt. It is a curious fact that drunkards and drug addicts make very evil psychic atmospheres, whereas a person who is a common criminal, however bad, is not nearly so noxious and his atmosphere fades rapidly. In these two cases there was no question of an entity, discarnate or incarnate, being concerned in the matter. There was merely an unpleasant mental atmosphere generated by some powerful and painful emotion that had been experienced over a considerable period at that spot. Such a concentration, if very strong, will linger almost indefinitely. The structures that saw the concentration may have been pulled down and new ones built, nevertheless the forces remain, like a previous exposure on a photographic plate, and sensitive people are affected by them. The insensitive may escape comparatively scatheless. It is not altogether an easy matter to determine whether the disturbance is due to atmosphere alone, or whether an earthbound entity complicates the situation. Where an entity is present, it will usually be seen sooner or later. Moreover, it will usually be heard as well as felt. This latter sign, however, does not invariably indicate the presence of an organized entity. For I know of a case wherein a room that had been used as a lodge of ritual initiation was subsequently partitioned into an office and 2 bedrooms after the lodge was moved elsewhere. And the bedrooms were practically uninhabitable owing to the din of cracks, bangs and thumpings that went on at night. In such a case there was no reason to suspect the presence of any entity, for the rituals had not been of an evocative type, nor was the influence evil. It was merely force in a state of tension. It was sheer physical noise that made the disturbance, as I can testify, for I have slept, or rather, tried to sleep, there. Where a ghost is seen, it is usually also heard because for a form to be sufficiently substantial to be visible there must be a modicum at least of ectoplasm in its composition, and ectoplasm is capable of exercising force on the physical plane. In some degree at least. Where a ghost is both seen and heard, we may be sure there is an actual haunting. Where it is seen, but not heard, it may possibly be that a person with psychic tendencies is perceiving the images in the reflecting ether, the photographic plate of nature, and there may be no actual entity present. Where the disturbance is heard, but not seen, it may be due to astral forces set in motion by ritual magic, and which continue for a while after the original impulse is withdrawn. These may be perfectly harmless, save that they disturb the sleep in the same way that a rattling window would do. On the other hand, if powerful evocative rituals have been performed, and the clearing of the sphere has not been properly done, profound disturbances may result and the whole situation be exceedingly unpleasant. Examples will again help to make the problem clear. As an instance of a non-ritual haunting, I may cite the case of a friend of mine who went to live in a block of modern mansions. From the first she was not happy there, and as time went by the oppression and distress strengthened. Coming into her drawing room one evening at dusk, she saw in the half-light a man standing with his back to the room, gazing intently out of the window. She switched on the light, and found that there was no one there. On several occasions her maid saw someone walk down the passage leading to this room. Moreover, the hall door had a knack of coming open of its own accord. My friend's depression deepened until finally, when standing herself at the drawing-room window one day, she had a sudden impulse to fling herself out. Then she realized that things were serious and that liver pills and a weekend at the seaside would not put them right. Being an occultist, she understood the significance of the happenings that had been going on in her flat, and she made inquiries concerning the history of the square in which this block of modern mansions had been built. She learnt that it was the site of an old madhouse of sinister reputation. The form that she and her maid had seen was probably that of some unfortunate patient of suicidal tendencies who had succeeded in giving effect to his impulses on a spot corresponding to the situation of her room. The terrific emotional forces generated by his brooding and last desperate act were photographed on the atmosphere, as it were, and suggested to her mind thoughts of self-destruction just as the ill temper or depression of a companion will induce a similar mood in ourselves without any word spoken. Another example within the sphere of my experience, although it was not actually my case, is of much interest in that it combines an example of a very definite poltergeist haunting with vampirism. I was once consulted by a mental healer to whom a very curious case had been brought. Some charitably disposed people had raised funds to found a home for unwanted babies, and a suitable house had been purchased on the outskirts of a village not far from London. The house had been a conspicuous bargain and they were very pleased with it. Soon, however, they began to be disturbed by some very curious phenomena, and also by inexplicable illness and seizures among the babies. One child, in fact, actually died, and its death was not satisfactorily accounted for. Then one of the nurses, an Irish girl, began to be affected also. Celts are notoriously susceptible to psychic influences, and are always the first to be affected by them. It will be observed that the babies went down first under the attack, their resistance being low compared to that of an adult. And then the most sensitive of the adults was affected, the Irish Celt. On several occasions the sound was heard of a cart and horse coming up the drive, but when the maid went to the door to open it, there was nothing to be seen. Soon the ghost became even more energetic, and took to shoveling the coal from side to side of an outhouse. It would shift several tons of coal in this way in a night, the occupants of the house lying shivering in their beds while lumps of coal thudded and rumbled against the sides of the bunkers. As to why or wherefore this particular manifestation should take place, I can offer no suggestion. On several occasions different people saw a strange man crossing the hall, and immediately afterwards children were taken ill. Finally, in addition to all other troubles, mysterious fires began to break out all over the house. A basket of clean linen in an empty room was found to be on fire. Curtains were found to be smoldering. Meanwhile the unfortunate Irish nurse went from bad to worse, lying in bed too weak to stand up, and rapidly going off her head. It will probably be suggested that some mischievous or demented person was at the bottom of the trouble, but it is difficult to know what human agency either could or would shovel a truckload of coal across a shed single-handed during the night. The superintendent of the home was interested in mental healing and knew enough of the mind side of things to realize that something abnormal was happening in the house under her charge. She consulted a mental healer, who in her turn consulted me. I made a psychic diagnosis of the case, and reported that in my opinion the house had at some time been occupied by someone who had a knowledge of occultism, and who, being upon the left-hand path, objected strongly to going to face his portion of purgatory after the death of the physical body, and that he was maintaining himself in an intermediate state as an earthbound spirit by drawing upon the vitality of the unfortunate children, and had accidentally drawn too much from one, thus killing it outright. Working on this hypothesis, the healer undertook to give the case absent treatment. Needless to say, the officials of the home were not taken into our confidence. The result of this treatment was that the manifestations immediately ceased. No more children had seizures and the Irish nurse rapidly recovered. The superintendent was then told the hypothesis upon which we had worked. She was greatly interested, and made inquiries in the village as to the history of the house, and learned that it was notoriously haunted, which was the reason they had obtained it so cheaply. It appeared that no tenant could stop there long, and that there was a constant record of these exhausting and mysterious illnesses. It also transpired that about 60 years previously the house had been occupied for a long period by a man who was viewed askance by his neighbors as an eccentric and mysterious personage, and was reported to be engaged in some sort of research which necessitated the use of a laboratory into which no one was ever allowed to go, and in which he worked by night. It is interesting to note that neither the mental healer or myself ever visited the house or were within 20 miles of it, for it shows in what way these unseen forces can be manipulated from a distance. A final example, taken from the Confessions of Aleister Crowley, will serve to show the nature of a haunting produced by ceremonial magic in which the forces invoked are not adequately dispersed. The demons connected with a Bramelin do not wait to be invoked, they come unsought. One night Jones and I went out to dinner. I noticed on leaving the White Temple that the latch of its Yale lock had not caught. Accordingly I pulled the door to, and tested it. As we went out, we noticed semi-solid shadows on the stairs. The whole atmosphere was vibrating with the forces we had been using. We were trying to condense them into sensible images. When we came back, nothing had been disturbed in the flat. But the temple door was wide open, the furniture disarranged, and some of the symbols flung about the room. We restored order, and then observed that semi-materialized beings were marching round the main room in almost unending procession. When I finally left the flat for Scotland, it was found that the mirrors were too big to take out save by the way of the Black Temple. This had, of course, been completely dismantled before the workmen arrived. But the atmosphere remained, and two of them were put out of action for several hours. It was almost a weekly experience, by the way, to hear of casual callers fainting, or being seized with dizziness, cramp or apoplexy on the staircase. It was a long time before these rooms were relet. People felt instinctively the presence of something uncanny. It is well known to all psychics that the sites of ancient temples where mystery rituals have been worked, are always potently charged with psychic force. This force need not necessarily be evil, but it has a powerfully stimulating effect upon the psychic centers and stirs up the subconscious forces. And as the majority of civilized people suffer in a greater or lesser degree from what Freud calls repression, such a stirring of the subliminal mind produces a feeling of profound disturbance. We should not unquestioningly attribute evil influences to a place or a person that causes us discomfort. It may merely be that psychic force at a greater tension than we are accustomed to is disturbing our equilibrium. The sites of monasteries that were disbanded with persecution at the time of the Reformation are also frequently badly haunted by psychic forces. The group mind of a religious community is a very potent thing, and when it is disturbed by the corporate emotion of its members, the forces thus let loose are not readily dispersed. Moreover, the monks, initiates of the mysteries of Jesus, would not be likely to hand over their sacred places to the despoilers with any good will. It has been reported again and again that a curse rests on those who profited by the spoliation of church lands. This is too well known to require discussion in these pages. There is another fact in connection with church property, however, which may not be so well known, and that is the frequency with which psychic happenings are reported in connection with vicarages. In inquiring among friends and fellow workers for data in connection with the research that has gone to the making of this book, I have been astonished how frequently a vicarage has been mentioned in connection with the phenomena of which I have been told. The rituals of the church are, of course, ceremonial magic, as is admitted by even such an orthodox authority as Evelyn Underhill. The average clergyman is not conversant with the technique of occultism, and has therefore little or no understanding of what he is doing. What influences he brings to the altar, and what forces he takes away therefrom, must therefore be an open question in each individual case. A man whose consciousness has been exalted by ritual, and who does not know how to seal his aura and return to normal, is liable to psychic invasion. Objects associated with any form of ceremonial operations are invariably highly charged with magnetism and intimately linked with the force whose uses they have served. I remember, many years ago, when I had but little knowledge of occultism and no pretensions at all to psychism, that two friends and myself were amusing ourselves by turning over each other's trinket boxes. I picked up a handsome amethyst cross from one of them, and immediately exclaimed, "There is something extraordinary about this cross. It feels as if it were alive." "That was the cross that was given me at my first communion," replied my friend, "and it was originally a bishop's pectoral cross." Her sister was greatly interested, and immediately brought her own jewel case to me and asked me if I could pick out her first communion cross also, for, like her sister, she was a Roman Catholic. And these crosses that were given them as presents on the occasion of their first communion had been specially blessed by the priest. I was greatly interested to observe that from 3 or 4 ornamental crosses I was able to pick one which felt warm and living and electric to the hand, and pass it across to her, saying, "This is your communion cross," and it was. I remember once, as a small child, picking up a dying rook. The creature lay motionless on my knee for a few minutes, and then gave a flutter and died. I had never seen death before, but I needed no one to tell me that I saw it now. The feel of the creature, before and after that flutter, was different. I can only compare the feel of the magnetist and the unmagnetized crosses to the difference between the living and the dead bird. But the Christian is not the only religion that can magnetize its ceremonial instruments. There are other ritualistic religions, and some of these are debased. We ought to use much caution before we place about our rooms as ornaments objects which may have been associated with cults whose nature we do not understand. Many of them, of course, belong to the Brummagem cult, and are dedicated to no more desperate deity than Mammon, but the genuine curio is a different matter. I had an example of this once in the British Museum. I was visiting the room in the basement which contains a collection of plaster casts of the famous statues of antiquity, the originals being elsewhere. Suddenly I became aware of a sense of magnetic power. I turned towards it, and saw a small altar. Reading the label, I found that this was not a cast but the original. It is a very interesting test of psychism to sample the atmosphere of the different rooms of the British Museum. The benign and brooding peace of the Buddhist room is a thing to be remembered. The flavor of the long ethnological room is a thing to be got out of the mouth as quickly as possible. To me, at any rate, the Egyptian room is disappointing. The mummies all seem neither malignant or benignant, but merely cynical. Perhaps I should feel differently, however, if I spent a night with them. Magnetism, which is dispersed during the day, charges up again during the silence and darkness of the night. I remember visiting Stonehenge amid a crowd of trippers and char-a-blancs, and thinking that the glory had departed. But it was a very different affair when I visited it in the desolation of a bleak spring day after its long winter solitude. It had charged up again, and was as formidable as anyone could wish. I should hesitate, therefore, to say that because the mummies and I have never struck sparks when we met in the British Museum, that their reputation is groundless. At the time that Tutankhamun's tomb was being opened I said to myself, if the mummy's curse does not work in this case, I shall lose my faith in occultism. We all know how it has worked, even unto the third and fourth generation. No novelist, deriving his ideas of ancient Egypt from an encyclopedia article on Egyptology and some photographs, would have dared stretch the long arm of coincidence anything like as far. The Egyptians attached great importance to the preservation of the physical body. The tombs of great men, as is well known, were protected by means of what are popularly called spells, and the power and scope of Egyptian magic are things that very few people realize. The modern student of occultism who reads iamblichos on the Egyptian mysteries, will have a surprise. In most cases, however, the purchaser of Egyptian curios has nothing to fear. The worst that they will yield to psychic investigation is a vision of labor disputes in a mass production factory. I have, however, heard of a very wonderful psychometric reading which was obtained from a mummy which, when subsequently unrolled, was found to consist entirely of French newspapers of recent date. I have always been greatly amused by the indignation of Egyptologists against tomb robbers. After all, is there any distinction between the earlier and later visitors to a tomb save that one lot work by day and the other by night? In the view of the people who made the tomb, and spared nothing to render it inviolate and preserve the peace of their dead, the workers by night would probably be preferred, for they merely robbed, and did not strip and expose the nude bodies to the public gaze. There was a terrible outcry recently when some bodies were moved in a village churchyard to make room for the monument chosen to decorate the grave of a famous public man. Even the people whose religious feelings were not outraged by this act of sacrilege regarded it as in shocking bad taste. Yet nobody proposed to strip the grave clothes from the body of someone's wife or mother and photograph it stark naked. When it comes to the question of a mummy's curse, I am afraid that my sympathies are entirely with the mummy. The initiate is strictly counseled that he should never blaspheme the name by which another knoweth his God, for it is the same force that he himself worships represented by another symbol. The ways to God are as many as the breaths of the sons of men, says the old Arab proverb. We should have enough sympathy with the struggles of another soul towards the light not to desecrate the things that are sanctified by his hopes and endeavors, even if by nothing else. The Father of us all may understand their significance better than we do, and by his acceptance consecrate them forever. There are many Europeans who have a great affection for the Buddha, and have his statue in their rooms, though sometimes they confuse it with Shenrisi, the stout and beaming god of good luck. That the influence of that great being, the light of Asia, is noble and benignant, I would be the last to deny, but the statues of the Buddha are a different matter, and need to be approached with caution if genuine. Some of the worst black magic in the world is a debased form of Buddhism. To say this is not to insult that venerable faith, for it is only lack of opportunity that prevents the black mass from occupying that dubious eminence. In the Tibetan monasteries of the Dugpa sect there are temples each one of which contained literally thousands of statues of the Buddha. On various occasions one or another of these monasteries has been raided, either by rival religionists or Chinese troops, and its curios scattered. To be the possessor of one of these Buddhas, Magnetiste by Dugpa writes, is not a very pleasant thing. I had a curious experience with a Buddha upon one occasion. It was an archaic soapstone statuette, some 9 inches high, and its owner had dug it up herself on the site of a Burmese city that had fallen in ruin and been swallowed by the jungle. It was placed on the floor in an angle of the stairs, and served as a doorstop upon occasion. I had a flat on the top floor, and had to pass the melancholy little Buddha each time I came in or went out, and to me it seemed a desecration to see the sacred symbol of another faith treated thus. I tried to point this out to her, and asked her how she would feel if she saw a crucifix thus utilized, but without result. Meanwhile the little Buddha sat there patiently, getting the carpet sweeper pushed in his face and receiving libations of slops. One day, passing upstairs bearing a bunch of flowers, I was prompted to throw before him one of the traditional marigolds of Indian devotion. Immediately I was conscious that a link had been formed between myself and the little statue, and that it was sinister. A night or two afterwards I was returning home rather late, and as I passed the Buddha I had a feeling that there was something behind me, and looking over my shoulder, saw a ball of pale golden light about the size of a football separate itself from the Buddha and come rolling up the stairs after me. Thoroughly alarmed, and disliking this manifestation very much indeed, I immediately made a banishing gesture and the ball of light returned down the stairs and was reabsorbed into the Buddha, who, needless to say, got no more marigolds from me, and received a very wide berth until I left the flat shortly after. The experience was a singularly unpleasant one, and was a sharp lesson to me not to meddle with the sacred objects of another system unless I knew exactly what I was about. I learnt subsequently that some of these statues are consecrated with the blood of a human sacrifice. I do not mean to imply by this that all Buddhist statues have been so treated. Such consecrations are, I should imagine, comparatively rare. But I think no one who has a knowledge of the facts will deny that they occur, even as one might occasionally come across a crucifix which had been used upside down at a black mass. It is not every case of psychic disturbance, however, which originates externally. It is a well-known cosmic law that everything moves in circles, and whatever forces we send out, and whatever thought forms we extrude from our auras, unless absorbed by the object to which they are directed, will return to us in due course. One of the most effective, and also one of the most widely practiced methods of occult defense is to refuse to react to an attack, neither accepting nor neutralizing the forces projected against one, and thus turning them back on their sender. We must never overlook the fact that a so-called occult attack may be evil thought forms returning home to roost. There are certain types of insanity in which the lunatic believes himself to be the victim of an attack by invisible beings, who threaten and abuse him and offer base or dangerous insinuations. He will describe his tormentors, or point to their position in the room. A psychic who investigates such a case can very often see the alleged entities just where the lunatic says they are. Nevertheless, the psychologist can come forward and prove beyond any reasonable doubt that the so-called hallucinations are due to repressed instincts giving rise to dissociated complexes of ideas in the patient's own subconscious mind. Does this mean that the psychic is mistaken in thinking he perceives an astral entity? In my opinion, both psychic and psychologist are right, and their findings are mutually explanatory. What the psychic sees is the dissociated complex extruded from the aura as a thought form. A great deal of relief can be given to lunatics by breaking up the thought forms that are surrounding them, but unfortunately the relief is short-lived. For unless the cause of the illness can be dealt with, a fresh batch of thought forms is built up as soon as the original ones are destroyed. Chapter 7. The Pathology of Non-Human Contacts. There are other forms of life as well as ours whose sphere of evolution impinges upon the earth. In the realm of folklore we constantly meet with the idea of intercourse between the human and the fairy kingdoms. Of the marriage of a human being with a fairy spouse, or the theft of a child by the fairies, an impish changeling being left in its place. We shall be rash if we assume that an extensive body of folk belief is entirely without foundation in fact. Let us therefore examine these old and crude beliefs and see whether we can find any grounds for them, and if so, what the real nature of the facts may be. And whether they throw any light upon modern psychic phenomena of the kind we are considering in these pages. There are many of us who have met people who might well be described as non-human, soulless, in that the ordinary human motives are not operative with them, nor do the ordinary human feelings prompt or inhibit them. We cannot but love them, for they have great charm, but we cannot but dread them as well, for they spread an infinitude of suffering around them. Although seldom deliberately evil, they are singularly detrimental to all with whom they come in contact. They, for their part, are unhappy and lonely in our midst. They feel themselves to be alien and uncompanioned. Every man's hand is against them, and in consequence it all too often happens that their hand is against everyone and they develop a puckish malevolence, though there is seldom calculated evil-doing. Gratitude, compassion, good faith, morality and common honesty are utterly foreign to their natures, as far beyond their conception as the differential calculus. They are not immoral, however, but simply non-moral. On the other hand, they possess the virtues of absolute sincerity and great courage. In terms of human ethics they are undesirables, but they have an ethic of their own to which they are loyal, and that is the beauty which is truth, and this is all they know, and, as far as their life is concerned, all they need to know. In appearance they are usually small and slight, possessing unusual physical strength and endurance but very liable to nervous exhaustion and brainstorms. In social relations they take violent likes and dislikes. They show a facile and demonstrative affection towards those they like, but quickly forget them. Gratitude and pity are unknown to their nature. Towards those they dislike they are pettily malicious, and in all relations of life they are utterly irresponsible. One cannot describe them better than to say that they resemble nothing so much as a blend of Persian kitten and pet monkey. They have the beauty and aloofness and charm of the cat, and the amusing, mischievous destructiveness of the monkey. Many human beings hate them at sight. Others are fascinated by them because they bring with them a sense of unearthly beauty and a quickening of the life forces. I have been able to investigate the history of two such beings, and it is interesting to note that both of them were conceived while their mothers were under the influence of drink. There is a very great deal of information available concerning the occult aspect of the incarnation of souls, but not much of the knowledge concerning the actual facts of conception has ever found its way into print. I have given a little in my book, The Esoteric Philosophy of Love and Marriage. I cannot enter into the subject deeply in these pages, for it would be too much of a digression. Some points, however, it is essential to touch upon for a comprehensive survey of our subject. At the moment of sexual union a psychic vortex is formed resembling a waterspout, a funnel-shaped swirling that towers up into other dimension. As body after body engages, the vortex goes up the planes. In all cases the physical, etheric and astral bodies are involved, the vortex therefore always reaches as far as the astral plane. A soul upon the astral plane may be drawn into this vortex if it is ripe for incarnation, and thus enter the sphere of the parents. If the vortex extends higher than the astral plane, souls of a different type may enter this sphere, but such extension is rare, and therefore it is said that man is born of desire, for few are born of anything else. But this vortex may not only extend vertically up the planes, speaking metaphorically, but it may also, under certain conditions, be deflected, as it were, out of the normal human line of evolution. So that its open end extends into the sphere of evolution of another type of life. Under such circumstances it is theoretically possible for a being of a parallel evolution to be drawn into incarnation in a human body. Occultists hold that this occasionally occurs, and explains certain types of non-pathological abnormality which are occasionally met with. These non-humans are either adored or hated by their human associates. They have a peculiar fascination for certain types of temperament, the types that psychologists call the unstable. In these types the subconscious comes very near to the surface, deep calls to deep, and they are instinctively drawn towards the elemental kingdoms. There is nothing more disastrous than marriage with a non-human, for they have nothing in their nature that can satisfy the normal human yearnings for affection and sympathy. The one saving feature in such a union is that grounds for divorce are invariably readily available, for the morals of the non-human are those of the barnyard. The power of non-humans to injure their enemies is comparatively small, for they are aliens in a strange land when incarnated in human form, and cannot avail themselves of any of the ordinary human resources of mischief. They are, in fact, singularly defenseless and helpless, and themselves suffer acutely at the hands of society. It is otherwise, however, in their relations with their friends. They seem to have an infinite capacity for inflicting hurt on those who love them. Not deliberately or maliciously, but like a child pulling flies to pieces out of idleness, not realizing what it is doing. Obeying the laws of their own nature, they are destructive to beings of the human evolution. Yet what other laws can they obey? For them to submit to our standards is to deny their deepest instincts. The effect they have upon those who love them constitutes such a well-marked syndrome among the psychic pathologies that we must consider it in detail. The person who forms a rapport with a non-human becomes deeply stirred by the elemental forces that find ingress to our sphere through the channel of this wandering, alien soul. He becomes, as it were, drawn away from normal human things and set wandering upon the confines of the fairy kingdom, and yet he can find there no rest for his foot and no sustenance for his soul. The story of the handsome fisher lad and the mermaid is indicative of this condition. She loves him, draws him to her, and he drowns, for he cannot live in the element of water. The explanation of the curious power, both of fascination and destruction, which is exercised by non-humans may lie in the fact that they belong to one element only, whereas in man all four are combined. Any elemental contact is stimulating to us, because elemental beings pour forth in abundance the vitality of their own particular sphere, and this vitalises the corresponding element in ourselves. But if a four-element creature is drawn into the sphere of a single element, he is poisoned by an overdose of the one element in which he finds himself, and starved of the other three. It is for this reason that mortals in the fairy kingdom are always said to be enchanted or asleep. They are never living normally in full possession of their faculties. An equally difficult problem is set to the non-human who is drawn into our midst. A single-element creature is bidden to control and assimilate an additional three elements for which it has no equipment or experience, and the result is disastrous. But it is not enough that we should merely describe the conditions and state the problem in these pages. Our aim is essentially practical. What then can be done when a non-human has to be faced and dealt with? It must be clearly realized that any mating between a human and a non-human is a hopeless proposition. In the first place, it can only be the preamble to a divorce, because non-humans are promiscuous in their sexual habits. And, secondly, there is nothing in the nature of a non-human that can satisfy the higher aspirations of the human. We must not allow the human form to mislead us as to the existence of a human soul. A non-human is a pet animal, not a fellow creature. That, frankly, is the only possible ground upon which they can be approached. If we expect no more of them than we should of a pet bird, if we manage them as we should manage a kitten, we have got as near to the solution of the problem as we are ever likely to get until the dark angel mercifully restores them to their own kingdom. A mercy seldom long delayed, for non-humans do not make old bones. Human beings may also come into touch with elemental beings by themselves venturing into the spheres of elemental life. Such contacts need not necessarily be harmful to either kingdom provided those who enter into them know what they are about. In fact, such associations are frequently entered into by occultists in the course of their work and researches, but it is an undertaking for the advanced initiate only, not for neophytes. There are cases, however, where such an association may lead to harm. The human partner in the association may be ill-equipped or ill-adapted for the undertaking. He may have ventured out beyond his depth, having picked up a formula from some more experienced occultist and used it without proper preparation. Or again, it is not uncommon to find people who have brought through from previous incarnations a natural aptitude for getting into touch with the elemental kingdoms. In such cases it may occur that an elemental who has had experience of relations with human beings may deliberately get into touch with them. This is in every way undesirable, for the elemental has not got the knowledge of human conditions necessary to enable it to avoid injuring its new friend. In any case, elementals have got a one-way intelligence, and it is not well that they should be senior partners in any alliance with human beings. The whole question of elemental contacts, an exceedingly fascinating one, is too extensive and intricate to be entered upon in these pages. It has been necessary to refer to it, however, for certain cases of psychic difficulty may be due to inexpert operations on both sides of the veil. These elementals, or nature spirits, are quite different to the controls with whom spiritualistic circles come into touch. The spiritualistic movement is highly organized on the inner planes, and promiscuous controlling is not permitted. Controls have, in fact, to sit for development in just the same way that mediums do, and there is invariably some experienced entity within call who can come to the assistance of the circle if all is not going well. Western occultism was thoroughly disorganized and broken up by centuries of persecution. Its inner plane conditions, consequently, present many tangles and gaps even to this day. It is nothing like as well organized as the spiritualistic sphere. The great orders have their definite contacts and work strictly within them, keeping a firm hand on neophytes. Outside the orders there is a good deal of chaos and banditry, and it is unwise to venture far save in the company of an experienced occultist who understands the technique of the methods employed. There are many people for whom the Deva kingdom, as the sphere which the elementals share with the nature spirits is sometimes called, has a great fascination, and they try by meditation and ritual to get into touch with it. In my opinion it is decidedly risky for a person who is not an initiate to attempt this work. It is exceedingly apt to lead to mental unbalance, if not to actual obsession. Not that the nature contacts are evil, but they are profoundly disturbing to the human consciousness because they stir those atavistic depths which the psychoanalyst aims at laying bare by means of his technique. Anyone who is acquainted with the literature or practice of psychoanalysis knows that the abreaction is an important factor in this system. It is a crisis, and can, for the time being at any rate, upset the patient pretty thoroughly and exacerbate all his symptoms. When we touch the elemental contacts we get the same reaction that is caused by psychoanalysis when the censor is being penetrated. Persons in whom the subconscious mind is near the surface, such as the artist, the crank, the unstable, and, for the matter of that, the genius in any walk of life, love the elemental contacts because they stimulate the elemental forces in their own nature which are to them the springs of their power and inspiration. But the average citizen, whose mental content is organized largely in a basis of repression and compromise in order that he may be a citizen at all and take his place in organized society, is upset by the elemental contacts according to the proportion of repression to compromise in his makeup. Compromise is the normal lot of humanity, repression is the pathology of compromise. The person who has managed to effect a working compromise between the different elements of his nature can afford to allow himself a holiday with the devas without doing anybody any harm. But the person who is repressed will find that they disagree with him actively because they are having the same effect upon him that a drastic psychoanalysis would have. We hear sometimes of the tragedy that results from taking the last dose in a bottle of tonic of which arsenic is one of the ingredients. This is due to the fact that the bottle has not been thoroughly shaken up each time a dose has been taken, so that the arsenical sediment has all collected in the last dose and reached a poisonous concentration. So it is with the elemental contacts. They are a potent tonic, but they can reach a poisonous concentration under unsuitable circumstances. I have never come across or heard of a case of pathology due to the fascination of the element of earth. It is not an element that usually attracts the amateur experimenter, though the initiate appreciates its value and importance. I have come across cases, however, of sensitive people dwelling in a mountainous country, especially in narrow gulches where there is a paucity of sunlight, who have become obsessed with the fear of the mountains. They do not fear so much that the mountains will fall upon them as that they will close over them, as the cave closed upon the children who followed the Pied Piper of Hamelin. The psychiatrist will, of course, recognize this symptom as belonging to the well-known psychoneurosis of claustrophobia. This, however, does not invalidate my statement. For in my opinion we may find that in a more intimate knowledge of the elemental kingdoms we shall come upon the clue to both claustrophobia and agoraphobia. Mountaineers also know this peculiar terror with which the great hills can obsess mankind. It is neither giddiness nor mountain sickness, but a curious oppression of the spirits by the overwhelming grandeur of nature. The same force, when not at a poisonous concentration, inspires the passionate love of the hills or of the sea that Kipling has celebrated so gloriously in one of his poems. The pathologies of the element of water may be a fascination so great that a man will walk out into the sea until he drowns. Swinburne had this peculiarity, and has immortalized it in several of his poems: strike out as the heart in us bids and beseeches, a thirst for the foam. On one occasion he was picked up in the open sea by a Breton fishing smack, swimming tirelessly, many miles from land, borne on the sea by currents, but oblivious of his danger. Being rescued, he sat upon the deck with his mane of red hair drying in the wind, chanting sea poems to his rescuers, a spectacle that one would have given much to witness. Another curious case of water pathology I knew personally. A very level-headed woman, a school teacher, was obsessed by a horror of rough waves. She always declared that if she went on the seafront to watch a storm, the waves made a dead set at her. She lived at a seaside place, but so great was her dislike of the waves that she did not care to walk on the promenade when the tide was in. She was cured of her fear in a curious way. She took initiation into co-masonry, and found to her surprise that from that day forth she was free from her fear of the sea. I am not a co-mason, and speak subject to correction, but I believe I am right in saying that co-masonry differs from other forms of masonry in that elemental invocations have been introduced into it. The element of air, as all occultists know, is a very tricky element to deal with. More initiates turn off the path in the grade of air than in any other, and it is rare to see a ritual of air worked without something being dropped or knocked over. It is a quarrelsome element. When it is being worked, the operators are apt to bicker and squabble. It is also intimately associated with sex, as is revealed by its symbolism. If an occultist is making a magic circle, and for any reason wishes to seal it with the cherubim of the elements instead of the archangels, as is more commonly done, and feels himself unequal to the task of drawing a presentable eagle, the symbolic form of the cherub of air, he will use the zodiacal sign for Scorpio. The evolutionary connection between the snake and the bird is well known to biologists, but long ages before Darwin, initiates used the serpent and the eagle to represent the unsublimated and sublimated aspects of the life force. The scorpion connects with the serpent through the dragon. I had a very curious experience myself in connection with the element of air. I am betraying no secrets if I say that certain grades of initiation refer to the elements, for the fact is too generally known, and too obvious, for it to be any more mysterious than the Queen of Spain's legs. To begin with, I have an exceptionally bad head for heights, and as the abyss of height belongs to the element of air, I obviously have no natural affinity with it. The ceremony went exceptionally badly even for an air ritual. Two of the principal officers, husband and wife, helped to maintain its reputation as a contentious element by having a family jar in the middle of the proceedings, and the usual upsets and smashings occurred on a generous scale. For the next fortnight I lived in the midst of a cataclysm of crockery. I smashed my way through 2 entire tea sets and all the mantelpiece ornaments. The ornaments just fell off the mantelpiece one by one of their own accord. I actually saw 2 of them do it. I did not know at the time that the element of air had this sinister reputation. I realized that something queer was afoot, however, and asked my teacher about it. She was much amused, but I was not, because it was my crockery that was supplying the raw material for the phenomena. She advised me to get into sympathetic touch with the sylphs, as the initiation had evidently not been altogether successful. I tried to do this, but I was in London at the time and met with no success, for the elemental contacts, with the exception of fire, cannot be worked successfully in a city. The smashing went on, and I was reduced to a tin mug and a toothglass, for I saw it was useless to get any more china until things had settled down. Then I went away for my summer holiday and found myself on the summit of a high and isolated hill on a day of bright sun and high wind. I was very conscious of the nearness of the elemental kingdoms. The air seemed full of silver sparkles, which is always a sign that the veil is thin. There was no one present save some friends who were sympathetic. I faced into the wind and raised my arms in invocation. Suddenly we saw below us a figure bursting through hedges and leaping ditches and running wildly towards it. We presently recognized it as another of our friends, and when he joined us he told us that he had felt the sudden rush of power while in the valley and on an overpowering impulse started for the hilltop. Then all of us, without any suggestion of leadership, began the dance of the elements, whirling like dancing dervishes upon that hilltop. Fortunately nobody was about, but I do not know that it would have made very much difference if they had been, for we were caught up out of ourselves and the air seemed full of rushing golden flames, lying level in the wind. For days afterwards we seemed charged with elemental energy by that extraordinary dance. It may be interesting to note that we danced with a circular movement, each revolving on our own axis at the same time, and that we both danced and revolved diasil, that is, with the sun. All this occurred spontaneously, the tide of the elements catching us up and away. I have never known a more glorious experience. It was indeed the divine inebriation of the mysteries. After this there were no more smashings of crockery. I have already noted my exceptionally bad head for heights. I have found that it is considerably mitigated, temporarily at any rate, by the invocation of air. I am of the opinion that the curious impulse which causes people for no reason whatsoever to commit suicide by throwing themselves from heights may be due to the same impulse that causes people who are obsessed by the element of water to swim out to sea. As I have recorded of Swinburne. These apparently causeless suicides by water and air are, in my opinion, a form of union with the God which is one of the ideas underlying human sacrifice. There are two types of human sacrifice, the willing and the unwilling. The unwilling sacrifice, the prisoner struggling or drugged into passivity, is used, not to propitiate the God, as is usually thought, but in order that his vital forces may serve as a basis of manifestation. The willing sacrifice, in which the victim will be either a priest or a devotee of the God, has for its motive the idea of divine union, not altogether unknown to Christian mystics, who seek its achievement by a living death. Whereas the adherents of Juggernaut escape with one brief pang. The European belief of one man, one life, has imbued us with the idea of death as the supreme evil. Therefore the European very often does not go to his death when he unites with the elements, but his higher self withdraws from incarnation, leaving his body ensouled by a curious kind of intelligent automaton, which deteriorates rapidly. Whatever may be the status of the soul that withdraws, that which is left behind is not nice. I feel, therefore, that it must seriously delay and distort the evolution of the human monad if it turns aside into the sphere of the deva evolution. It may well be that some of the creatures whom at first sight we might classify as non-humans are really humans who have had a deva phase in their karmic record. There is a very interesting field of research awaiting the person who systematically investigates the past lives of the weak-minded and the mentally deranged. The pathologies of the element of fire are also rare, though it may be that the aimless incendiary and pyromaniac belong to this class. I have never personally had any opportunity of investigating this type of case. Algernon Blackwood writes of one in his very interesting story, The Regeneration of Lord Ernie, which is published in his volume of short stories entitled Incredible Adventures. Indeed, this author is exceedingly fond of drawing his inspiration from the Deva kingdom, and has some most interesting studies of the subject scattered through his books. Any organic geographical unit develops something of an oversoul, and where the differentiation is marked, the oversoul may become a very definite entity. If there are among the inhabitants of the district any who are sensitive to the unseen, they may form either an affinity or a repulsion for this oversoul. A great forest has a very marked personality, and there are few white men who can resist its influence, becoming markedly changed and dehumanized if exposed to it for long periods without the companionship of others of their race. Natives, on the other hand, seem to enter into it and be part of it. It is well known how often trees are objects of worship in all parts of the world. They have very marked personalities and strong magnetic fields. In the spring, when the sap is rising, even non-psychics can often see the aura of a tree. It can best be seen by getting at a distance of a couple of 100 yards and looking at the sky beyond the top of the tree. The aura will then be perceived as a whitish cloud, like a patch of lighter colored sky, surrounding the top of the tree, and usually swaying gently from side to side. There is a curious antagonism between elms and humanity, and about orchids all sensitive persons agree there is something sinister. Tropical vegetation, as a whole, is overpowerful for humanity. Under the tremendous stimulation of the solar fire, the elemental forces are concentrated to a poisonous strength. I am not personally acquainted with the west coast of Africa. But from what I can gather, I am of the opinion that the elemental forces and the atmosphere made by juju rites are between them more responsible than the climate for earning that part of the world its sinister reputation as the white man's grave. There are other spots where the climate is equally hot and humid, Burma, for instance, but there is no other spot that produces the same loosening of moral fiber. The only place that is at all comparable to it is the Caribbean Sea, which produces, not so much a demoralization, as a fierceness and violence quite alien to the racial characteristics of the people who go there. Chapter 8. The risks incidental to ceremonial magic. If the problem of psychic self-defense is to be adequately dealt with, we must have an understanding of a subject upon which very little has been written, the nature of the forces of intelligent and organized evil. The great faiths of the ancient world all had their evil gods as well as their beneficent deities, and they did not call these evil gods devils. In Hinduism we have Shiva and Kali, in the Egyptian system we have Set and Bes and Typhon. In the Grecian pantheon there are Pluto and Hecate. All the other faiths, also, have their angelic choirs, their archons, or builders, and all the hierarchy of heaven. Protestant Christianity alone has forgotten its angelology. The Creator has to be both architect of the universe and bricklayer, forming man from the dust of the ground without assistance. If we refer to Paradise Lost, however, we shall find that Milton was familiar with both divine and infernal hierarchies, and that these were graded and charted according to a definite system. Anyone who is acquainted with the Kabbalah will recognize that in Milton he meets a fellow Kabbalist. In the Kabbalah we find the esotericism of the Old Testament. I propose to use the Kabbalistic terminology to explain the esoteric theory of evil because, firstly, it is the one I am most familiar with. Secondly, it forms the basis of Western occult thought and all medieval magic is based upon it, together with much modern magic. Thirdly, it is, in my opinion, singularly lucid, coherent and comprehensive. And being a system consecrated by antiquity, I cannot be accused of romancing, or fabricating my own system. In order to render my concepts clear, a brief explanation of Kabbalistic doctrine must be given. As it is not possible to enter into an exposition of this vast system, I will state certain axioms dogmatically, and explain them by illustration instead of argument, thus obtaining the maximum clarity for the minimum expenditure of space. The initiate recognizes two kinds of evil, negative evil and positive evil. Negative evil is the polarizing opposite of good. Let us try and make this clear by an illustration. Every action gives rise to a reaction. The forward drive of the bullet is equated by the recoil of the gun. Everything which moves has to have the equivalent of a thrust block against which to push, something firm under its feet from which to take off. It is difficult to walk on a slippery surface because it offers no resistance. We must have something for the foot to grip, to push against, and give us the forward impulse at each step. Negative evil is the thrust block of good. The principle of resistance, of inertia, that enables good to get a purchase. But negative evil is more than this. We might call the principle of resistance the negative aspect of negative evil. For it has also a positives aspect, the principle of destruction. We can best explain the cosmic function of the principle of destruction by calling it by its esoteric name of the scavenger of the gods. Its function is to clear up behind the advancing tide of evolution, removing that which has become effete so that it may not choke and clog evolving life. We now find the answer to the eternal riddle as to why God tolerates the devil. The devil is the cosmic thrust block and scavenger of the gods. It is this aspect of evil which is given a more detailed symbolism in the pantheons of other faiths, having its Shiva and Kali, or its Pluto and Hecate aspects. We can now see why these resistive and destructive forces are classed as gods and not as demons, for they are reactions according to cosmic law, not anarchical and chaotic forces. We now come to the consideration of positive evil. This again has a negatives and positives aspect. Its negatives aspect is pure chaos, unformed substance and uncoordinated force. It has been aptly called the cosmic abortion. To drift into the sphere of negative, positive evil is like being caught in a psychic quicksand. We are now ready to consider the sphere of positive evil, the demons themselves, or the Qliphoth, as they are called in the Kabbalah. In order to understand their significance we must make a further excursion into Kabbalistic philosophy. The Creator is conceived of as bringing the universe into manifestation through a series of divine emanations, 10 in number. These are called the 10 holy Sephiroth, and are represented in a diagram as arranged in a particular pattern. This is the famous tree of life, the key to all symbolism. The Sephiroth were not emanated independently, each from the divine source, but overflowed, the one from the other. As soon as one Sephira has emanated another, these two are said to be in equilibrium, compensating each other. But there is a period during the emanation of a Sephira when the force is not yet in equilibrium, but is pushing out unsupported, like an incomplete arch. It is the uncompensated force emanated during this epoch of unbalance, and never subsequently absorbed after the establishment of the new sphere, which constitutes positive evil. There are, therefore, 10 kinds of positive evil, just as there are 10 divine emanations. To these spheres go, according to their kind, all the evil imaginings of the heart of man that are not neutralized by repentance or compensated by the overplus of good in other members of the same group soul. There is a deep occult doctrine here which we cannot enter upon now, it must suffice to state it dogmatically in explanation of the Kabbalistic conception of the Qliphoth. When we consider all that must have been poured into these 10 sinks of iniquity since the days of Atlantean magic, through the decadence of Babylon and Rome, down to the Great War, we can guess what rises up from them when their seals are broken. Not only do influences emanate from them which tempt and corrupt souls, each according to its susceptibility, but time has served for the formulation of evil intelligences. These probably originated through the workings of black magic, which took the essential evil essence and organized it for purposes of its own. The beings thus formulated assumed an independent existence, developed, and multiplied their kind. They appear as dreams and hallucinations, and may produce a considerable degree of objective phenomena, such as noise, deposit of slime or blood, balls of light, and, above all, stenches of an amazing pungency. The 10 divine emanations are personified as archangels, and the 10 infernal emanations are personified as archdemons. It is these which are the names of power in magic. Each Sephira, then, has its obverse side in the corresponding Qliphotic demon. The initiated adept always gains control over the demonic force before he attempts to utilize the angelic force which, by the appropriated means, can be contacted in each Sephira. If he does not do so, he contacts them both simultaneously. Moreover, the planets, the elements and the signs of the zodiac are all intimately connected with the Sephiroth, being arranged upon the tree of life in a pattern known only to initiates. The initiated adept is exceedingly careful what he does when he is working with these potencies because he knows that he has always got the Qliphoth in the background. The uninitiated occultist goes ahead gaily, juggling with such names of power as he has picked up from the innumerable books on the subject now available for the general reader, thinking that if he does not invoke the demons he will not get them. He forgets that every planet is a Jekyll and Hyde. Consequently, ceremonial magic has got a bad name owing to the unpleasant frequency of untoward results, just as surgery got a bad name before the days of Lister. It is the imperfect technique that is the trouble. I was once doing some experimental work with geomancy, which is a method of divination belonging to the element of earth. Now all divinations, when performed according to their esoteric formulae, always begin with an evocation of the genius that presides over that particular operation. The genii of geomancy are not of a very high type. I was imperfectly familiar with the method, and was trying to set up my prick figure on a piece of paper instead of using a tray of wet sand as I should have done. Things began to go wrong, and the room was filled with the most terrible stench of drains. The appropriate banishing ritual was immediately performed, and the air cleared. But there was not much doubt about the objectivity of this phenomenon while it lasted. A very interesting case is given in the Occult Review for December, 1929. In a letter to the editor, signed H. Campbell. Desiring some information which I could not get in any ordinary way, I resorted to the system of Abramelin, and to this end prepared a copy of the necessary talisman, perfecting it to the best of my ability with my little stock of knowledge. The ritual performed, I proceeded to clear my place of working. A little knowledge is a dangerous thing. My ritual was imperfect and I only rendered the talisman useless without in any way impairing the activities of the entity invoked. This looks like nothing else than gross carelessness on my part, and to a certain extent this is true, but the point I wish to make is this, that my knowledge of this particular system, and therefore my ritual, were imperfect. And in any case, I had been shown no method of combating this particular entity when once aroused. Now note the results. Unfortunately, I have no account of the date when these occurrences began, but the first hint of trouble must have come on or about March 3, 1927. I can guess the date with fair accuracy because, as I was to learn, the manifestations were always strongest about the new moon, and after I had gone to sleep. Upon this occasion I can remember waking up suddenly with a vague feeling of terror oppressing me, yet it was no ordinary nightmare terror, but an imposed emotion that could be thrown off by an effort of the will. This passed almost as soon as I stood up, and I thought no more about it. Again on April 2, or thereabouts, I was troubled by the same feeling, but regarded it as nothing more than a severe nightmare, though the fact that my sleep was distorted towards the time of the new moon had occurred to me. While as full moon drew on, the nights were peaceful again. The new moon of May brought a recurrence of the trouble. This time very much more powerful, and necessitating an almost intolerable effort of will to cast it off. Also it was about this time that I first saw the entity which was rapidly obsessing me. It was not altogether unlovely to look at. Its eyes were closed and it was bearded, with long flowing hair. It seemed a blind force slowly waking to activity. Now there are 3 points which I must make quite clear before I proceed. In the first place, I was never attacked twice in the same night. Secondly, when I speak of physical happenings, the smashing of glass and voices, they were never, with one absolutely inexplicable exception, actual, but pure obsessions, and this leads to the third point. Not one of these incidents happened while I was asleep. Always I found myself awake with the terror upon me and struggling violently to cast off the spell. I have had nightmares before, but no nightmare that I have ever had could hold my mind in its grip for minutes at a time as this thing did, or send me plunging through a 10-foot-high window to the ground below. The first indication I had that these visitations were absolutely out of the ordinary course of events came on May 30. About midnight I was suddenly awakened by a voice calling loudly, "Look out," and at once I became aware of a red serpent coiling and uncoiling itself under my bed, and reaching out onto the floor with its head. Just as it was about to attack me I jumped through my window, and came to earth among the rose bushes below, fortunately with no more damage done than a badly bruised arm. After this there was absolute peace until June 30, when the real climax came. I had seen the thing again on the night of the new moon, and had noticed considerable changes in its appearance. Especially it seemed far more active, while its long hair had changed into serpent heads. The night after I was awakened by a violent noise and jumped out of bed. I then saw the noise was caused by a great red obelisk which crashed through the west wall of my room and leaned against the wall at the east end, smashing both that and the window to pieces but missing my bed, which was in an alcove to the left of its path. In its transit it had smashed all the mirrors, and the floor and top of my bed were strewn with broken glass and fragments of wood. This time the obsession must have lasted some minutes. I dared not move for fear of cutting myself, and to reach the matches, wherein, I knew, lay safety, I had to lean across the bed and again risk the glass. Yet in my heart I knew that all this was false, but had no power to move. I could only stand there, incapable, looking at the shattered room in a state of hopeless terror. And now comes the most extraordinary part of the whole business. When I had finally mastered the obsession, I went to bed again dead tired, and I know that the only sound I made that night was jumping to the floor. Also my room is at least 100 yards from the rest of my family. Yet next morning at breakfast I was asked what was the terrible noise in my room during the night. After that I realized that the game was up. I had not taken these occurrences lying down, but I knew that it was impossible for me to try and control the force which I had set in motion. In desperation I turned to a good friend, who, I was aware, knew much of these things. She did not hesitate, but came at once to my assistance, and from that day to the present the trouble has absolutely gone from me. Such is the case. And I only hope it may warn those who are contemplating my folly to treat with the greatest of care any printed systems of magic, and not to use them at all unless they have the fullest control over the entities invoked. Among the general public, who do not dabble in occultism, the results of a magical mishap are never seen, and the only doctors who ever see them are fellow initiates who happen to be medical men, and they, naturally, keep silence. The catastrophes are of varying degrees of severity, ranging from a bad fright to a fatality. I cannot say much upon these subjects, for they are among the most secret paths of occult lore. Enough must be hinted, however, to reveal what, under certain circumstances, may be experienced. I do not think it in the least likely, however, that the cleptotic demons will be encountered save through the use of ceremonial magic. They are as rare as anthrax in England, but it is as well to know the manner of their manifestation so that, when encountered, they may be recognized. The great majority of dabblers in occultism are protected by their own ineptitude. They fail to get results, and consequently come to no harm, but if they should succeed in getting results they would find that they had their hands full. The serious student, unless he is working under skilled guidance, may also find himself in difficulties, and for various reasons. He may be insufficiently experienced in the operation he has undertaken, for in magic theory is one thing and practice is another. A student of occult science will often take a formula out of a book and try to use it. He might just as well study the instructions in a book on surgery and try to operate. Most formulae are incomplete, there is always unwritten work. Some of the barbarous names of evocation, which the uninitiated use as words of power, are really the initial letters of a mantric sentence or formula. I came across an invocation once in which the word of power was Tegatu. On investigation this turned out to be the battered remains of the great architect of the universe. Even an experienced occultist may get into difficulties if he attempts magical work when he is in bad health, overtired, or has had even a moderate amount of alcohol, for very little is too much when the invisible forces are being handled. Equally does this apply to each of his assistants. A chain is no stronger than its weakest link, and if one of the team cannot handle the forces, everybody is going to suffer. A ritual lodge is no place for the well-meaning ineffectual. There is an immense amount of dabbling in occultism going on today. Most of it is innocuous because it is totally ineffective, but there is never any knowing when one is going to strike a live wire. Take, for instance, the advertisers in various occult papers who offer to supply charms that work. One of two things is certain. Either they do not work at all, in which case one is wasting one's money on them. Or they work by means of some power with which they have been charged. What is the nature of that power, and did the persons who made the charm or talisman really know what they were about? Did they take the precaution to bind the baser aspect before magnetizing with the higher aspect? These are the elementary precautions of the practical occultist who has been properly trained. Did the maker of the talisman know them? Again, one buys second-hand books on magic. Who was the previous owner and for what purposes were these books used? Or one buys a new book which has been brought out by some occult school for propaganda purposes. These books are often magnetized before they are sent out, and so form a magnetic link between the purchaser and the order which caused them to be issued. Or someone may join a group who has previously been associated with another occult group whose contacts were debased. Unless the proper precautions are taken, that person will bring the psychic contagion in with him, and his fellow members may have unpleasant experiences. I well remember it being said to me by an occultist of great experience that two things are necessary for safety in occultism: right motives and right associates. We lull ourselves into a false security if we believe that good intentions are sufficient protection. My advice to the would-be student is to invoke the master to send him an initiator, and to refuse to attempt any practical work until he is fully satisfied that the initiator has been found. I cannot here enter into either the precautions to be taken against untoward happenings in practical occult work, nor the remedies to apply if they take place. I will merely indicate the signs by which such an eventuality may be recognized. This is all that can be done, and all that is necessary in a book of this type. The initiate knows what to do without need of guidance from me, the non-initiate cannot do anything, and must seek assistance. It is enough for him if he knows when such assistance is needed. If things go wrong in the course of a magical ceremonial, the power shorts, and someone, it may be the operator, or it may be the weakest person in the team, gets knocked out as if he had received a punch from an invisible pugilist. When picked up, he will be very dazed and badly shaken, and will certainly be some days, possibly weeks, before he gets over it. He will be in a state of complete prostration and considerable mental confusion, which will gradually wear off. Unless there is some organic defect, such as hereditary mental instability, a bad heart, or hardened arteries, there will be a complete recovery, given time. But naturally it is a bad outlook should one of these conditions be present, and those who have them should not take part in occult experiments. Personally, I do not believe that the invisible forces alone will ever actually cause the loss of life or permanent disability in the absence of any physical lesion. The person who goes out of his mind as the result of a psychic shock would have gone out of his mind if he had been in a railway disaster or any other drastic emotional experience. Unless the psychic atmosphere indicates otherwise, it is not necessary to do any banishings, or take precautions against obsession, because the power has dispersed itself in the very act of inflicting the shock. During my early days of occultism I developed my powers very rapidly because I recovered the memories of previous incarnations en bloc, and with them the capacities acquired in previous lives. And I shook myself up severely on numerous occasions before I learnt the technique of handling the invisible forces. I never experienced any permanent ill effects from my mishaps, though I admit that upon occasion I have been extricated by my friends from a considerable amount of debris. During the early days of my occult career a girl was brought to me by a mutual friend, who told me that the mother of this girl, an ardent student of occultism, seemed to have a terrible effect upon her daughter. The mother was a widow, and mother and daughter lived together under very comfortable material circumstances. But whenever the girl made a friend, or showed any desire to leave home, the mother performed extraordinary antics, coming to the daughter's room at night and drawing signs in the air about her bed. The effect of all this upon the girl was most peculiar. She felt unable to free herself from the mental domination the mother had obtained over her, and she was wasting away in a most curious fashion. When I saw her, although able to get about, she looked like nothing I have ever seen save a famine victim. I made a psychic investigation, and formed the opinion that the mother was working by means of an entity of which she had obtained possession. How this had been accomplished in the present instance, I do not know, but such things are common in occultism. I determined to take on the case, and to chase and, if possible, break up this artificial elemental. I was away from the group I was accustomed to work with, but among people keenly interested in occultism of every sort, size and description, and I had no difficulty in picking up a team to help me with the undertaking. I had no qualms about the undertaking. A second-hand elemental, directed by a woman with only a rule-of-thumb knowledge of magic, did not appear to me to be a formidable opponent. I had seen a good deal of practical occultism, had lent a hand at similar operations, and possessed the necessary formulae. So I went round the town, asked certain friends to lend a hand, and others to come and see the fun. To be frank, our attitude was that of a party of small boys going ratting. We met at the appointed time and place, formed our circle, and went to work. The method I meant to use made it necessary for me to leave my body, and the group were really there to look after it while I was out of it, and see it came to no harm. I got out onto the astral readily enough, did my job, and returned, feeling very pleased with myself, for it was the first time I had operated entirely on my own, without the supervision by my teacher. As I began to recover physical consciousness, which is just like coming round from an anesthetic, I had a sensation as of machinery running, and felt as if I were lying on something very lumpy. I opened my eyes, and saw something brown towering above me to an enormous height. As I gathered my senses together, I discovered that I was lying on the floor, close to the skirting, across the feet of an unfortunate man, who was thus securely pinned against the wall, and it was he, shaking in his shoes. That had felt to me like the vibration of machinery. Various other members of the circle slowly and reluctantly reappeared from behind the piano and sofa and other heavy articles of furniture. They had seen some practical occultism for once in their lives, but they did not appear to like it. It appears that, after I had gone out and left them with my unconscious body, they got a good deal of phenomena in the way of bells and voices outside the circle. If they had kept quiet, it would have been quite all right, but they lost their heads and scattered. Then, the circle being broken, I began to perform antics, arching up on my head and my heels and, in some way that has never been explained, arriving at the far side of the room at the feet of one of the circle, which, of course, did not improve matters. Then an extraordinary thing happened. We were just gathering ourselves together, thinking that everything was over, when a force of what nature I have never known suddenly rushed round the circle, and one member seemed to take the brunt of it. He went flying across the room and landed, fortunately for him, face downwards in an armchair, and was ill in bed for 3 weeks. While all this was going on, the father of one of the people taking part became uneasy about her, and walked across from where he lived at the far side of the little town, to see what was happening. Like most little country towns, this one usually went to bed early, but he told us that as he came along he saw that innumerable windows were lit up, and he heard the sounds of children crying all down the street. When I think of the risks I took and the conditions under which I worked in those early days, I wonder that I or any of my friends are alive to tell the tale. It is said that there is a special providence to look after fools, drunkards and little children. I think there must be another that looks after inexperienced occultists and their friends. It may be interesting to note that as a result of this operation which I so rashly undertook, the girl was entirely freed from the domination of her mother, and began forthwith to put on flesh and rapidly became normal. That end of it, at least, was entirely successful. Another very curious case is that referred to in the Occult Review of January, 1930. The mysterious death of a student of occultism, Miss N. Fornario, is receiving the attention of the authorities at the present time. Miss Fornario was found lying nude on the bleak hillside in the lonely island of Iona. Round her neck was a cross secured by a silver chain, and near at hand lay a large knife which had been used to cut a large cross in the turf. On this cross her body was lying. A resident of London, Miss Fornario seems to have made her way to Lona for some purpose connected with occultism. One of the servants at her house in London stating that a letter had been received saying she had a terrible case of healing on. One newspaper report alludes to mysterious stories on the island about blue lights having been seen in the vicinity of where her body was found, and there is also a story of a cloaked man. Occultists no less than the general public will await with interest any disclosures that may be forthcoming concerning this occurrence. No disclosures ever were forthcoming, however, and conjecture alone can work upon the case. One detail only can I add to the brief but comprehensive report of the Occult Review. The body bore marks of scratches. I knew Miss Fornario intimately, and at one time we did a good deal of work together, but some 3 years before her death we went our separate ways and lost sight of each other. She was half Italian and half English, of unusual intellectual caliber, and was especially interested in the green ray elemental contacts, too much interested in them for my peace of mind, and I became nervous and refused to cooperate with her. I do not object to reasonable risks. In fact, one cannot expect to achieve anything worthwhile in life if one will not take risks, but it appeared to me that Mac, as we called her, was going into very deep waters, even when I knew her. And that there was certain to be trouble sooner or later. She had evidently been on an astral expedition from which she never returned. She was not a good subject for such experiments, for she suffered from some defect of the pituitary body. Whether she was the victim of a psychic attack, whether she merely stopped out on the astral too long and her body, of poor vitality in any case, became chilled lying thus exposed in midwinter. Or whether she slipped into one of the elemental kingdoms that she loved, even as Swinburne swam out to sea, who shall say? The information at our disposal is insufficient for an opinion to be formed. The facts, however, cannot be questioned, and remain to give skeptics food for thought. It may be as well to say in concluding this chapter, that when I speak of the experiments of ceremonial magic, I do not mean ritual initiation. Now a ritual initiation is of course ceremonial magic, and so, for the matter of that, are the sacraments of the Church. But the occultist, using his terms perhaps somewhat loosely, does not include the initiatory rituals when he speaks of ceremonial magic. There are many varieties of initiatory ceremonies, but these are all designed to work upon the soul of the candidate only. Ceremonial magic, on the other hand, in the technical sense of the term, is designed to work upon the soul of nature. The two operations, although there are innumerable forms of each, are entirely different in type, and aim at, and achieve, entirely different results. There is a strong prejudice against ritual magic among those interested in popular occultism owing to the strictures passed upon it by Madame Blavatsky. Now mind Blavatsky was trained in the Eastern school and had very little, if any, practical acquaintance with the inner aspect of Western occultism, nor was she a master of its methods. She spoke from an Eastern standpoint and judged Western esoteric conditions by those she had seen in the East, where tantric magic has become depraved in the hands of Dugpa and similar sects. In the dense and materialistic atmosphere of the West it is exceedingly difficult to get any results worth mentioning without the use of some form of ceremonial. Even the Theosophical Society, of which she was the foundress, has unconsciously drifted into Western methods, adopting the Catholic ceremonial and the Masonic initiations as side chapels to its main temple, and the mixture is giving trouble. The "back to Blavatsky" movement within its ranks may be able to produce a much purer ethical and metaphysical teaching, but I think we may safely prophesy it will produce no practical results, in Europe at any rate. Ought we to eschew ceremonial methods because occasionally, in inexpert hands or under unsuitable conditions, they lead to disastrous results? Ought we to eschew motor racing, or mountaineering, or flying, or research into the nature of radioactive substances? All these take their toll of life each year. There is an unjustifiable risk which no level-headed person will run if they can help it, and there is a justifiable risk which everybody must be prepared to take who wants to come out of the ruck. It is not every follower of the inner way who is suitable for ceremonial work, just as it is not every individual who is fitted to handle the controls of an aeroplane. But there are some people, both men and women, to whom a spice of danger is a spur which brings out the mettle of their pasture, and these will always be found in the van of great adventure. Part 2. Differential Diagnosis. Chapter 9. Distinction between objective psychic attack and subjective psychic disturbance. Psychism, however genuine, is a fruitful cause of self-delusion. A psychic is invariably highly sensitive and suggestible. This is the basis of his gifts. Psychism not being a normal development, among Europeans at any rate, the psychic is, in the language of nautical engineers, over-engined for his hull. He is consequently unstable, liable to violent emotional reactions, and in general exhibits those aberrations of conduct we are accustomed to associate with artistic genius. Unless a psychic is trained, disciplined, protected and watched over by those who understand his condition, his psychism is never reliable because he is blown about by every wind of influence. The psychic and the neurotic are closely akin in their reactions to life, but the neurotic differs from the psychic in that, instead of being over-engined for his hull, he is underhulled for his engines. The result is the same, however, a discrepancy between the force and form with the consequent inability to maintain a central, reasoned, directing control. The technique of the occult discipline is largely directed towards maintaining control of the disparate forces, compensating the sensitiveness of the psychic, and protecting him from unwanted impressions. It is never well to learn how to open the door of the unseen unless at the same time one learns how to close and latch it. As was noted in the introduction, it is comparatively seldom that the unseen comes in search of human beings. As the caterpillar told Alice concerning the puppy dog, "You let it alone, and it will let you alone." But if we begin to study occultism, or even to dabble in it, sooner or later we are liable to obtain results, provided, of course, that the system we are using contains the germs of efficacy. In the case of a person who is coming onto the path for the first time, progress is necessarily slow and laborious. But a soul that has taken initiation in previous incarnations may reopen the latent psychic faculties so rapidly that the problem of maintaining the harmonized coordination of the personality becomes a serious one. It is exceedingly common for a person who is making his first contact with the occult movement to experience psychic disturbance. This is sometimes attributed to evil influences, sometimes to evil entities. Neither of these inferences may be just. There is a third possibility, which is responsible for by far the greater percentage of victims, the mere fact that consciousness is being disturbed by an unaccustomed force. How common a thing it is to see a child feverish and fretful during the first few days of a seaside holiday. It is not necessarily sickening for an illness. The strong air and unaccustomed food and the excitement of its new surroundings are disturbing its sensitive physical equilibrium. So it is when the neophyte is disturbed at the outset of his occult career. The unaccustomed vibrations are upsetting him, and he is having an attack of occult indigestion. In both cases the treatment is the same, temporary restriction of the diet which has caused the disturbance. Another cause of psychic upset may lie in the partial recovery of the memories of past incarnations if these include any painful episodes, especially such as are connected with esoteric studies. The entry of occult concepts into the conscious mind tends to awaken the subconscious memory of similar experiences in past lives. The emotion surrounding a memory is invariably recovered before the actual image of the incident. This is one of the best tests for the accuracy of memories of past lives. This foreshadowing emotion may hang about for a long time on the threshold of consciousness before the images clarify sufficiently to become tangible. If the emotion that is rising over the horizon is of a painful nature, it may cause considerable disturbance, and in the absence of an experienced advisor may be attributed to an occult attack. Or to the psychic perception of evil influences in the occult group to which the neophyte is affiliated. It is necessary to use very great caution in drawing conclusions from the psychic impressions of an inexperienced student, who is apt to be as full of alarms as a 2-year-old thoroughbred. On the other hand, the instinctive reactions of a pure and sensitive soul are not to be ignored. There are such things as black lodges and evil entities. We must not allow the cry of "Wolf! Wolf!" to make us either callous or careless. In any case, the victim is suffering remediable discomfort. It is an exceedingly difficult thing to determine psychic ally whether the complainant has reasonable grounds for his feelings, for his own imagination will have filled his atmosphere with menacing thought forms. It is no simple matter to decide whether these thought forms are subjective or objective. The wisest way is to rely on such evidence as is capable of objective examination, and inquire into the record of the particular group or occultist against whom the charges are being brought. But it is equally necessary to inquire into the record of the person who is bringing the charges. That person is filled with the loftiest ideals is no proof that he has a level head, a clear and unbiased judgment, or appreciation of the nature of evidence. A person need not be a deliberate liar to make statements that are very far from the truth. Another factor which has to be reckoned with is the vagaries of the sex instinct in a person in whom that instinct is repressed. Consider the case of a woman, perhaps no longer young, whose circumstances for the first time permit her to follow her own inclinations. A very common case with home-keeping women, who have to wait for dead men's shoes before they can set out on life's journey. She takes up occultism, towards which she may always have had a leaning, and joins some circle for studying possibly ritual initiation. The leader of that circle will in all probability be a person of strong individuality. The inexperienced, love-starved newcomer is glamored. Ritual is a very stimulating thing, as Anglo-Catholic clergy have found to their cost. The woman, possibly quite ignorant of the facts of life, finds herself strangely stirred. She is frightened, she senses that something of the kingdom of Pan is approaching. Her instincts will usually guide her truly enough in divining the source from which the disturbing influence proceeds. She will point an unerring finger at the magnetic male. She will seldom take into account the reactions of the female in the presence of the male. If she is a woman ignorant of the facts of life, the charge she brings will usually take the form of an accusation of hypnotic influence. She does not realize that nature is the hypnotist. If she is a woman who knows something of the world, the charge may be of improper advances. One glance at the woman is usually enough to tell us whether there is likely to be any foundation in this charge or not. It is seldom the young and pretty girl, who might reasonably be apprehensive, who is the teller of these stories. It is a curious fact that it never seems to occur to the complainants either to take refuge in flight or put the matter in the hands of a solicitor. If at the end of a long tale, full of dark hints and unspeakable innuendos, the question is asked, what exactly did he do? The answer usually is, he looked at me in a meaning way. When one of these stories is being told, we should be wise to give more attention to the bearing of the person who is telling it than to the facts alleged. This will usually yield the more valuable information. It is the most difficult thing in the world to get a genuine victim to speak. A woman who is broadcasting the tale of her own shame is usually a woman scorned, and the reliability of her testimony in the matter is in inverse ratio to her loquacity. Do not let us forget that it takes two to make a scandal as well as a quarrel. And the person who admits a mistake and asks for help to retrace wandering footsteps is much more likely to be worth helping than the one who claims to be even as the angels in heaven, where there is neither marrying nor giving in marriage. So great is the need for caution in assessing the facts in a charge of immorality that the law courts will not accept the evidence of the victim, even on oath and under cross-examination, unless it is supported by additional testimony. Equally well does the doctor know the same type of mentality, and a common form of mental derangement is called old maid's insanity, even in the textbooks. I could cite cases by the dozen in exemplification of the preceding statements, but they have not sufficient occult interest to justify their inclusion in these pages. If the leader of the group is a woman, a different set of reactions comes into play, though the same causes are at work. It is not generally realized that the fixation, or crush, of one woman for another is really a substitute love affair, as is proved by the fact that the girl who has plenty of admirers, or the woman who is happily married, is never given to them. In this case, just as much as in the normal, heterosexual attraction, hell knows no fury like a woman scorned. It is not, for obvious reasons, possible to bring charges of improper behavior. Though in one accusation this was alleged against me, and I was accused of being a man in disguise and attempting to seduce the complainant, and the charge found believers. The charge brought in such cases usually takes one of two forms, the mechanism being either, you don't love me, therefore you are cruel. I have been badly treated, and the most far-fetched instances are raked up in support of this charge. Or, you don't love me, therefore I hate you. The attraction you have for me is hypnotic. It must be borne in mind in assessing these charges that a trained occultist, especially if of high grade, has an exceedingly magnetic personality, and this is apt to prove disturbing to those who are unaccustomed to high-tension psychic forces. For whereas the person who is ripe for development will unfold the higher consciousness rapidly in the atmosphere of a high-grade initiate, the person who is not ready may find these influences profoundly disturbing. An adept who allows unsuitable persons to enter his magnetic field is blameworthy for his lack of discrimination and discretion, but he cannot justly be charged with abuse of occult powers. He emanates force involuntarily and cannot help himself. The greater adepts always live in seclusion, for not only do they need solitude for their work, but their influence upon unprepared souls produces too violent a reaction, and it ends in the cross or the hemlock cup. We must not be unmindful of the fact that the person who comes to us with a long tale of occult attack and asks for assistance, especially financial assistance, may simply be pitching a yarn. And should use the same discrimination that we would in listening to any other hard luck story, trying to differentiate between the deserving and the undeserving. I knew a man who allowed an alleged adept who was undergoing an alleged occult attack to take refuge in his studio, and returned after a short absence to find that the alleged one had been selling the furniture to buy drink. And there was every reason to believe that the only spirits who were in any way concerned with his troubles had entered the studio in bottles. The complaints of occult attack may have their source in nothing more or less than the delusions of the insane, and it does not necessarily invalidate this fact that a second person can be found to give supporting evidence. There is a curious form of insanity known to alienists called folie de deux, in which two people intimately associated together share the same delusions. It is usually found in such cases that one is definitely insane, and that the other is of a hysterical type and has become imbued with the delusions of her associate by means of suggestion. I use the feminine pronoun because this form of insanity is rare with males. It usually occurs with two sisters, or with two women living together. There is another pitfall for which the inexperienced do well to watch out in their dealings with the person who complains of an occult attack. Insanity may be periodic in its manifestation, outbreaks of acute mania alternating with periods of complete sanity. This periodic aspect should always be watched for in the case of women, in whom any